Hey, I've been releasing obscure Amiga games series for a little while now, and in the process we've all learned about some really fun and often virtually unknown titles. As a result of my recent poll on this very channel and Patreon, it became clear that you guys wanted similar series for DOS. And I'm happy to deliver, as believe it or not, but DOS may have as many if not more games than Amiga that never saw the limelight and were worth much more attention than they ever got. I'll keep the series in a similar 10 games per episode format so that they could be shorted palette cleaners, if you will, between long-form releases of my usual gaming history videos. So, not to waste any more of your time, let's get on with it. SpyCraft the Great Game is just that. A great, underrated and often overlooked game. Basically speaking, it's an adventure title depicting attempted assassination of the President of the United States and CIA and KGB's attempts to save him. While it's not endorsed by either of the organizations, the game focuses a lot on realism and even features former directors of both agencies playing themselves. So CIA's William Colby and KGB's Major General Oleg Kalugin. You're Thorn, a rookie CIA agent, and you learn that Russian presidential candidate has been assassinated by a rogue former CIA agent codenamed Harmonica. You'll quickly realize that American president is at Harmonica's crosshair too, and henceforth you'll travel the world meeting many people and gathering clues to prevent the killing and stop potential future international conflict. While SpyCraft is largely linear in its narrative design, following the FMV storyline and occasionally offering you puzzles and challenges to solve, nearing the end it will branch out a little, providing two alternate endings. Most FMV games were garbage, and yeah, you heard it here first. They either used FMV as a graphical gimmick to lure players in to purchase often dull or badly designed titles, offering so-called next-gen visuals and no substance. But there were also those that stick out that were better and offered something more, a genuinely good story, interesting mechanic or puzzles. Under a Killing Moon and Phantasmagoria are great examples of the latter. And SpyCraft, believe it or not, is really good too. So if you're into FMV adventures, this one's as good as they come. It features interesting and believable story, pretty decent acting and fun puzzles. Give it a go. Blackthorne is a side-view action platformer very similar to Flashback, but focused more on fun and bloody combat rather than puzzling. Story-wise, after 20 years on Earth, you have to come back to your home planet Tool to save it from evil villain Sarlacc's clutches. Armed with just a shotgun, you're a one-man army on a mission to do just that. Soon enough, you'll come across other weapons and items that can come handy in this quest one way or another. So, you'll be fighting off hordes of evil aliens, saving hostages and solving simple puzzles. I really like the cover mechanic where you and enemies as well really can hide in the background layer to avoid getting shot. It introduces a lot of tactics to otherwise simple shooting gameplay, and makes it feel deeper than your typical run and gunners are. The game's rather gory, so I obviously loved it back in the day, but the fact that it runs really well, looks great and plays awesome adds a lot to the fun factor. It never reached heights of popularity of Prince of Persia or Flashback, even though it should, as for me at least, it was always more engaging title than they were. If you've never had a chance to experience it, this one's a no-brainer and a lot of fun that should have been much more popular than it was. Track it down, load it up and get lost in hours of cool alien blasting. Tongue of the Fatman, aka Fatman, aka Mondus Fight Palace, aka Slaughter Sport, is a game with more titles than it deserved. One was enough really. Anyway, it's a late 80s versus fighting game with a gimmick. Said gimmick being the fact that you choose not between the specific named characters, but between their races. So there's humanoids, cyber droids, cryoplasts, amazoids, biohuskers, razors, mammoths, Pathians, celluloids, and lastly, colonoids. Origin of the name of that last race is not something that I'd ever want to learn, even though you can read those in-game. I'd rather let your imagination wander, or more likely, let your imagination forget about the name altogether. Each of the races have their own unique 15 basic moves and one special, and all play a little different. You start with only 3 to choose from, but as you progress through the game defeating certain races, they will be unlocked to be picked for the future encounters. The final boss is the titular Fatman named Mondu, whose special ability is so-called Tongue Lash, where his belly opens up and sprawls a tongue twig that jabs the enemy. So you. Despite him being the last character you play against in a single player, he's not as hard as some of the earlier ones can be. So yeah, that's 80s game design at its finest. But wait, that's not all. There are 24 different items in the game and they can be purchased between matches for money earned fighting or for wagering the fights, and up to 4 of these can be taken into the ring. Each of them is a singular use only, but they can easily make or break the game. Tongue of the Fatman features 3 bars for each player, one for health, one for crowd favor, and most important one, the red, for those noobs who try to complete fighting games with just one move. In short, if you try to spam the same technique, it will decrease it and at some point the attack will do just a tiny fraction of original damage. So you have to mix them up and not only rely on 1 or 2 moves. You can lose 3 times, it will cost you $100 to revive, but after 3rd that's it and you're down forever. Tongue of the Fatman is easily one of the weirdest versus fighting games I've ever seen, and definitely a title fans of the genre should play at least once. Lexi-Cross was probably one of, if not the most unusually designed game of 1991 when it released, and also among titles in this very video. For all intents and purposes, it's a futuristic TV game show, with gameplay elements borrowed from Scrabble, Wheel of Fortune and Battleship. Saying that the gameplay itself is odd is an understatement, but it's interesting, and when you get used to it, it's actually quite entertaining. Each player or player and CPU has a grid of hidden tiles that conceal various words. They take turns revealing said tiles in attempt to uncover letters or bonuses. Alternatively, players may spin the wheel to guess a letter. Whoever manages to form a complete sentence first wins. The gameplay idea may sound bizarre, but after a round or two becomes clear, and playing against a friend is really fun, provided that they enjoy word games, that is. Oh, and there's over 600 puzzles in Lexi-Cross, so you'll not get bored with it fast. Mines of Titan is an early turn-based tactical role-playing game by then widely unknown Westwood Associates, that still had few more years to go before they would become a household name with their Command & Conquer series. Mines of Titan is an enhanced remake of an earlier 664 game, Mars Saga. It's longer, features some new storylines, creatures, and its locations are moved from Mars to Titan. Duh. Cities and maps layout look identical, however. It takes place in the year 2261, when humans have long been colonizing the inner solar system and are about to finish terraforming Titan, Saturn's largest moon. You're Tom Jetland, as opposed to Tom Jet Takeoff, and due to an unforeseen event you crash land on Titan. With no means of transport and no money, you must find a way to get off this god-forsaken rock. So to raise funds, you must search for and recruit characters for your party to explore and survive in the unforgiving world of Titan. You train and develop your character and his companions by upgrading over 20 different skills, which all come in handy in both side and main missions. Quests themselves revolve around mysteries of Titan, uncovering vast conspiracies and telling the fate of disappeared Prosecinium colony. Other than that, you'll obviously need to raise enough credits to pay for a safe passage of Titan. Many of the enemies you'll encounter have special abilities, so the combat is quite tactical, with you planning your attacks and how to respond to enemies if they can't be counteracted beforehand at all. Interestingly enough, Mines of Titan is one of the few early role-playing games that gave you a complete freedom of choice when it comes to who to attack. You can go for the innocent and poor if you like, as much as you can aim high and try your luck with the police, because they drop one of the most powerful armors in the game, so it may end up being worth the risk. Mines of Titan is an interesting if overlooked game that should have gotten at least a bit more attention than it did. There is more unusual about ZZT than there's usual about it. That sentence did not make much sense, but it correctly describes how I feel about the game, as it's not going to be an easy one to explain. ZZT is an action-adventure puzzle game, but it's also seemingly unlimited object-oriented programming and scripting-based game creation system, all rolled into one, and all in simple color ASCII graphics. You control a smiley face in different grid-based levels where you have to solve puzzles and battle various creatures in one of 4 worlds filled with single-screen stages to the brim. You'll interact with objects like bombs, scrolls, ammo, torches and keys among others to solve all levels and reach the end of the game. ZZT is viewed from a top-down perspective and objects can be interacted with by either touch or by shooting at them. Game worlds are made up of levels/borders that connect with each other, and you can move between them by either reaching the edge that allows for passing or by teleports. The game starts in a hub with 6 exits. 4 lead to one of 4 worlds, and the other 2 respectively quote-unquote museum-type world displaying all the items, terrain and creatures included in the game, and second showing previews of all 4 worlds. The main goal, as mentioned earlier, is to reach the end board and complete the game by finding purple keys to open locked doors or gathering objects throughout the world. But on the way you'll be solving both puzzle boards, where clinical thinking is a must for progress, and they usually require untangling combinations of boulders, sliders and pushers, or mazes with invisible walls and teleports. Some of them, when botched, can impede your progress, becoming unsolvable, so make sure to save often. And there are also action boards, where you face off against lions, tigers and bears among others. These require not much more than reflexes. The included editing tools allow for unparalleled freedom of creativity and expression and were so popular that there's currently over 3,000 whole worlds created and archived online, all made within ZZT. And while the 3,000 may seem like a lot when talking about those worlds, overall the game was largely unknown. Interestingly enough, ZZT was originally programmed and released as a shareware title by Tim Sweeney. And if the name rings the bell, he's the one responsible for Epic Mega Games, then Unreal Engine, Fortnite and eventually Epic Launcher. So he knew what he was doing, it seems. Traffic Department 2192 takes place in the year, well, you guessed it, 2192, and it's a top-down multi-directional shooter. It was originally released as a shareware title with only one of 3 episodes available, and all 3 were unlocked upon purchase. Each of them consists of 20 missions. Shareware games were very popular in the 90s as they allowed developers to properly present the game to potential buyers, giving them a taste of what's in the full product, and promoting the game in the same time as they were free. Lack of publisher for smaller dev teams often limited their availability though, and that's why these were often overlooked and many were forgotten before getting a chance to shine. Anyway, you're Lieutenant Marta Luis Velazquez, a young pilot working for the traffic department in the metropolis of Vulthaven on the planet Siege. The vile gang known as the Vultures is slowly taking over the planet, and the traffic department is the hand of the law and the last line of defense. And since you're fueled by painful memories of vultures killing your father when you were just a kid, your disposition towards the gang is rather aggressive and you spare no efforts hunting them down. While the game is technically just a shooter, it features a complex intertwined science fiction story of cloning, mind control and cybernetics, all sprinkled with a touch of betrayal, bit of infiltration and a dash of warfare. Traffic Department 2192 is composed of 60 missions, before and after which lengthy cutscenes are featured, spanning over numerous screens each. The story of the game is supposedly well over 50,000 words, which is something many adventure and role-playing games of the time didn't have. It's worth mentioning that while Traffic Department is definitely a game for adults being chock full of profanity and sexually suggestive language, all of the mature content can be disabled at start. It's a truly unique game worth both your attention and time, if you're at least a bit interested in either a genre or games with deep and engaging storylines. Charlie the Duck is a horizontally scrolling 2D platformer clearly inspired by Super Mario games, in which, as you might have already noticed, you control a duck named Charlie. So, as in most similar titles, majority of the time you go from left to right collecting coins, diamonds and other items, usually found in crates that can be destroyed by jumping on them as opposed to from below, like in Mario games. You'll face various dangerous cute-looking creatures and generally will have the time of your life platforming your way to completion. Yep, I just heard that and let me explain. I obviously meant games completion and no other kind. Really, there's no profanities here. Charlie the Duck not only looks great, but plays as good if not better than Nintendo's original, even if it feels a bit more demanding. It's full of hidden passages and secret areas accessible through pools of water, because you're a duck, remember? And overall it screams quality in nearly everything that it offers. There's been many different games that try to imitate Mario's success, some more, other less plagiarizing the classic, but Charlie, while clearly based on the famous plumber, stands on its own and offers a lot of fun content without risking a lawsuit. And while generally speaking Charlie is impressive, it's not perfect and there's few things that could be improved. For one, the game features separate controls for fast and slow movement, which on a keyboard is more than annoying and requires some serious keystroke gymnastics and should be redesigned. But hold that thought, as we'll circle back to it in a bit. Sounds are sparse and there's virtually no music, which could also be expanded upon to offer more immersive, more climatic gameplay. And last but not least, the game's hard. Not Mario hard, harder, at least to me. Especially in the latter levels, so keep that in mind if you're looking for something more on easy and light side. Today, in 2023, Charlie the Duck is best played not under DOS but through Steam, as it was re-released and little redesigned to finally offer a singular movement pace. There's also more sounds and music added, offering a more rounded up and complete package. That said, if you wanna try it out the way it was originally released, DOS version is good too, just not as good. The Horde is a mixture of strategy and action and a bit of tower defense added for good measure, with no tower though. You're Chansey, a lowly servant boy who has become a knight after saving King's life from asphyxiation, which is quite funnily acted out in the game's introduction. Gameplay is divided into 2 phases. In first phase, you always lay traps, extend your village, build houses and farms, all within very restrictive time limit. In second, monsters attack, and you have to run around defending your settlement. And it can become quite hectic at times, with enemies charging from couple of sides, and you having to manage your time defending both flanks and disposing of the invaders. The Horde is quite ingenious, balancing the arcadish fighting with strategic planning and expansion of both your village and its defenses, while in the same time making sure that all the taxes to the king are paid in time. The Horde was criminally overlooked by majority of gamers when it came out, so if you knew of it and ignored it, shame on you. Shame on you, as it's a true gem and a title worth not only revisiting but also completing, as there aren't many like it even today. Now, imagine this. Adolf Hitler died in his childhood and World War II never happened. Instead, not much later than it would have taken place, aliens invaded Earth. And suddenly, both options seem equally as dramatic, and I honestly don't know which would be the worst scenario. But I'm leaning towards Adolf being the bigger body, cause he was a human who committed terrible crimes against his kin, humanity. And aliens perhaps just didn't know any better. Anyway, the reality of Corncup 3D is alternate to ours. Let's set that as a background constant. And you're the lone pilot who must help push the aliens back and keep the Earth safe. You do it in the only World War II plane that exists in this alternate reality, a 4U Corsair named Corncob. The game takes place in a variety of different locations, and while it's not grounded in realism as you fight against aliens, its simulation aspects and flight model have been largely praised by the small few who played it upon release. Funny enough, despite aliens being able to invade the Earth seemingly thousands of light years away from their homeworld, all they have to use against us are projectile weapons, not unlike our own. One would think that they would have lasers, plasma weaponry, or even something more advanced, like diarrhea-inducing lasers or freezing rays. Something, but to no avail it seems. The game features 3 full-length campaigns of 6 to 7 missions each, and most can be finished in between 5 to 20 minutes. While missions mainly focus on destruction of something, they are pretty varied from one another. So you'll destroy power plants, teleportation gates, and in one will even have to fly your plane into objective installation, kamikaze style, jumping out of your craft in the last moment not to die. It's one of those games that was so different than anything else that whomever got to play it remembers it even today. And this is where we hit the proverbial nail. Corncup 3D originally released as a shareware title, and henceforth it never gained enough widespread and recognition to be appreciated by more than just a few people who experienced it. It's also probably the only combat flight simulation I've ever encountered that allows for jumping out of plane and parachuting to safety just to carry on with your mission objective on foot. If you like simulations and enjoy games that virtually close to no one experienced, it's definitely one to see. It's an odd way to start, but Battle Wrath is not a very good game. In fact, it's adequate at best, perhaps not even that when compared to likes of Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat. Despite all that, however, it's an interesting title and more importantly a little known one. It's most likely historically the very first versus fighting game to use SVGA graphics. Not in 1997 when it released as full-fledged title, but in 1995 when it was still being sold as shareware game. In short, there's 8 great warriors from mainly fictional history, past and future, and after death they lock in an eternal fight to find whichever one of them is the best, the so-called ruler of the Battle Lords. The graphics are pre-rendered, kinda like those in Donkey Kong Country were, and I gotta say that they aged pretty badly. Definitely worse than those from Nintendo's game. Sounds are meh, and the animations leave a lot to be desired. Most of them are bordering between jumpy and unpleasant. Each of the warriors have their own set of regular attacks and a special one that uses power gems that you can charge up. If your opponent lets you do that, that is. And there's also a super special move, so-called Battle Wrath, but that can be used only by the number 1 ranked fighter, so it's hardly something you'll be doing often. The most interesting thing about Battle Wrath, at least for me, are the game modes. There's 2, irregular fights and ranked ones, with the latter allowing you to play the game the way it was intended, climbing the ranks. The higher you are at any given point in time, the more effective your fighter is, which is definitely an unusual approach to game design. Battle Wrath was very brutal, riding on Mortal Kombat's wave, but it's nowhere even remotely near the quality of that classic. So it remained as it started, ignored and then forgotten by the majority of gamers. Alien Logic is one of the most unusual role-playing games ever. It is based on obscure sky realms of the Jurun system, which I hope I pronounced correctly, and as that it follows the rules of it to a certain degree. It takes place on a planet Jurun 3,500 years after humanity moved to it, escaping depleted of natural resources and polluted Earth. Most races live on Jurun in peaceful harmony, but the ancient faction of Red Shanta is unhappy with the state of things and takes upon themselves to rid the planet of all humans. You play as a lone survivor of one of the Red Shanta's raids, the only person left standing from your village. The way the game is designed is more akin to an action-adventure title rather than the RPG, and that makes it very unique and interesting. There are no real stats and characteristics to speak of, and the game focuses mainly on puzzles and conversations with NPCs. You move about the world using a top-down map on which you can enter certain larger areas, which are also presented from a bird's view perspective and allowing for entering of particular small locations and points of interest. These, however, are side-scrolling. This is where you meet other characters, interact with them and objects in the game, and fight enemies or various creatures. Combat is action-based and relies heavily on magic, which is called Isho in the world of Jurun. Spells are both offensive and defensive, and having the right combination ready can be a decisive factor in many of the more demanding encounters. The most unusual thing about Alien Logic is its design, as it's intentionally non-linear, allowing players to complete the game in various ways, not always following the same plot path and solving many of the problems in different ways. Many if not most of the quote-unquote quests can be solved in at least 2-3 ways, only one of them being aggressive. While Alien Logic feels a bit clunky today, its open-endedness, and yeah, I know there's no such word, but whatever, I just made one. So, its open-endedness makes it a game unlike any other, and one worth tracking down and checking out as it's a real gem, even if unpolished one. NFL Challenge by XOR Software is a game that one of my viewers mentioned. I'm not sure if he'd like me to reveal his full name in the video, so let's call him Steven, which also happens to be his real first name, so it fits. Anyway, Steven was looking for a game that he remembered from way back and couldn't find. So obviously I wanted to help track it down, but I failed miserably. Like an overweight, washed out athlete trying to relive his youth competing against young ones. All I found was a similar game, but not the one Steven was after. He did so himself a little while later and shared the name with me. I looked it up, and here we are. NFL Challenge is an early American football simulation for 1 or 2 players in which you play as a coach of one of the NFL's teams, and you have to make the right decisions to ensure your team's wins. All the offensive and defensive plays that you pick will be acted out by the computer as they take no interactive part in the matches, other than deciding on the strategy, calling out timeouts and dealing with injuries and substitutions. It's an unusual choice, especially for the year when most games were focusing on action. NFL Challenge placed all its bets on strategy, and I suppose it was the right call as it makes for an interesting game. The matches are viewed from overhead perspective, with X's and O's representing players from both teams. Interestingly enough, an easy edit of a text file with rosters allows for creation of new and modification of existing teams and players. In 1985 there weren't many games like that, perhaps none, and to this day even there aren't many either. Toasty! Caveman Ugh-Lympics is a Stone Age-themed multi-event sports game for up to 6 players. It is composed out of 6 rather unusual disciplines too. Saber Race, where player races against an opponent, avoiding obstacles and constantly chasing them saber-toothed tiger. Mate Toss, where you have to spin and then throw your wife or husband as far as you can. For all intents and purposes, this is your typical hammer throw. Fire Making, where you're trying to create a full burn fire faster than your opponent does. Clubbing, which is not going from club to club at night, looking to down your sorrows in cheap alcohol, dance away your emptiness and eventually get lucky with a random stranger. It's a club fighting against an opponent trying to bash him off of a cliffside. Dino Race, which actually kinda explains itself. So you race a dinosaur and both you and an opponent have to avoid obstacles along the way. And last but not least, Dino Vault, in which you pole vault over a T-Rex. While the game itself is rather fun and the events are varied, the fact that it released so early lends itself to game's presentation. And despite sprites being pretty big and full of character, the game suffers having only EGA graphics and even worse PC speaker sound. Color palette is very limited and animations are rather choppy. If you can overlook that, however, it's a pretty fun collection of small sportish events that most fans of the genre should enjoy, for a minute or two at least. Wolf is part simulation, part role-playing, but full hidden gem that should be more popular than it ever was. In Wolf you're, well, a wolf, and you can either play in a freeform simulation mode where you have to lead your animal throughout its entire life, making sure that it survives unscathed, or in mission mode where you have certain preset conditions and an objective to fulfill. So, you hunt, search for and take mate, and even challenge your packmates. You have few senses that you can utilize to best survive in the wilderness. So hearing, smelling, following tracks and sight. The last one being the obvious one. And you use those to track and detect animals, search for water, or be warned of nearby harbingers of death, so humans. Senses show the rough direction and distance from a detected object or animal and are something you'll learn to rely on. It's worth pointing out that it's best to start with small prey while hunting until your wolf gets stronger, as larger animals can injure it if you're not careful. Injuries heal over time automatically, but only if your wolf is well fed. The pack of wolves you're part of has a natural alpha-beta hierarchy, same as in real life, and you can challenge other wolf in tail-waving minigame to rise within it. When you reach alpha status eventually, you can take opposite sex alpha to mate, and if all goes well, the female will become pregnant. When she gives birth to the cubs, they need to be taken care of for a year, so need to be protected and well fed at all times. When a year finally passes, they grow up and become full-fledged members of your pack. Same as in real life, humans should be avoided at all costs as they're absolute top of the food chain and can easily kill you or other wolves with just a shot or two. Other than Wolf's next year's successor aptly named Lion, I don't think there are many games that tackle a subject of, well, for the lack of a better word, managing an animal in such great detail. It may not sound like it, but Wolf is really fun, and if you enjoy games that are creatively different, you should give it a go. I don't know if you remember the late 80s as vividly as I do. Sure, there may be some, sometimes drastic differences in how and in what environment we were raised, but some things remain identical for all of us. TV and movies induced pop culture for one, and fueled by the whole plethora of various more or less explosive action flicks, starring likes of Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger, seeing a cover for Street Fighting Man would instantly grab my attention. I mean, look at this monstrosity, it's so cringe. And yet, back then it would have been the game, if judged by just the cover. And fortunately, the game itself is quite good too. It's an isometric scrolling beat-em-up in which you have to battle your way through numerous turfs belonging to different gangs spread between 5 major US cities of Denver, Atlanta, Detroit, LA and New York. Each gang has their own unique style and weapons, and they are not just copy-paste versions of each other and act different, some being stronger than others. And since we're on the subject of weapons, the usual culprits of knives, chains and crowbars are spread here and there and can be picked up to aid you on your way. You have a separate buttons for kicks and punches, and good mixture of both is what you need to pay out to countless tags to save your kidnapped love, Xiana. Because Street Fighting Man is really a revenge/rescue game. And while the plot is neither very good nor original, the game plays very well and is actually quite fun. Especially that the character sprites are pretty big, so all moves are distinguishable from one another. If you're into beat-em-ups, this one's definitely worth finding. Action Supercross is a precursor, an earlier version or beta event to the later Elastomania. But if you put them side to side, there's no difference, at least none I could find. Maybe it's number of levels, maybe something else, I don't know. But what I do know, that it is super fun. In essence, it's a side-scrolling trial bike obstacle course that uses semi-realistic physics in entirely unrealistic environments. They're so over the top that creating any of this in reality is borderline impossible. I mean, we could in theory sorta have all those ledges attached on one side to the wall, make them extra wide, but what am I even talking about? It's a game, and henceforth it uses game logic, and game logic allows for anything game designer's imagination can spawn. So, Action Supercross is that precisely. Super and full of action on a cross bike. Each next of the 47 levels is more convoluted than the previous, and some of those latter ones seem like little puzzles to figure out before even attempting to complete them. Few may require you hanging by one wheel on certain ledges, others may seek for daredevil-worthy acrobatics, or even smart planning of order in which each parts of the level should be tackled. All that because it's not a racer. You're on a stunt course and have to collect all apples, because they're yummy, juicy and ripe. Or for whatever else devs thought was a good reason to do so. But while it sounds simple, it's anything but. I've wasted weeks in Elastomania competing against a friend who sadly by now passed away. But that memory of us trying to figure out the levels and then beat each other's times is what I'm left with. And that's good enough given the circumstances. It's a brilliant little game, and those who never knew it should give it a go, as it's simply put amazing. Archon Ultra is a modern version of a classic 1984's Archon. It's a two-player game, at first glance very similar to chess, with light and dark pieces occupying opposite sides of the game board. Light represents good and dark stands for evil. Day and night, right and wrong, yin and yang, you get the gist. Both sides have differently looking but comparably spec'd pieces. When two of the opposing pawns meet on the game board square, they move to a separate arena where they battle each other in real time. Meaning that while stronger pieces obviously are more likely to win, it is not decided upon entering combat, and skilled player can defeat stronger unit with a weaker one, if he's proficient enough at Archon. It adds a lot to the strategy, as you may feel more comfortable with certain units than others and utilize that skill of yours against opponent's strongest pieces. Mixing a strategy of chess with frantic action-packed shooting/combat was a really fun idea, and one that should have gained more recognition than it did. Perhaps the reason for Archon's obscurity is the fact that it was based on an ancient by then title, and gamers were more into modern first-person shooters like Doom at the time. Or perhaps it was something else. Today, there's no way of telling. Anyway, it may not seem like it on the first glance in such a short video segment, but Archon Ultra is very playable, especially if you can find someone other than the CPU to compete against. Cosmic Soldier Psychic War, or in short just Psychic War, is a hugely expanded follow-up to earlier Cosmic Soldier, and it's a dungeon-crawling RPG. Well, technically speaking, at least, as it's not really dungeons that you explore in space. Anyway, the game is set in the year 3656 and you're exploring mysterious space station Samar, looking for evil Quilla Empire's hidden headquarters. They are the antagonists of the game and plan to take over the universe. Your task, should you choose to accept it, is to stop them. This message will self-destruct in 5, 4, 3. As you explore the Samar, you will encounter many characters and enemy psychic soldiers. Characters can be interacted with, and some will even want to join you on your quest, and then they can be used in battles too, which are action-packed and rely heavily on quick reactions and timing, and are sorta best compared to reverse tag of war, where you don't pull but push with your mental blast against the enemies, and try to overpower them. Imagine Dragon Ball Z's Kamehameha wave struggles between characters. It's similar. It's worth noting that if any of your characters' HP goes down to 0, they die and are unable to be brought back for the rest of the game. Overall, Psychic War is a good, if a bit too difficult for my liking game, that's unusual in its design and definitely not a title for everyone. It's one of those games that you have to give it a go yourself to figure out if it's something that you'd like to invest your time in. EGA Trek is a remake of one of the oldest computer games in existence. Wow, that came out epic. Anyway, I'm obviously talking about Star Trek, that ran on huge mainframes in the 70s and 80s. EGA Trek works great on a run-of-the-mill everyday PC, but drops the Star Trek naming, as clearly in the 80s copyright laws were already in place. Perhaps not yet in the form of DMCA, but still enough for the creators of the game to be fearful of potential lawsuits. It is for all intents and purposes Star Trek, however, and all species, races and ships within it, regardless the changes in their naming, come from the TV series. So the Union, aka Federation, is invaded by the Mongols and Vandals, so Klingons and Romulans respectively. And it's up to you to read the known 64 sectors in size universe of the Mongols altogether. Each sector is 8x8 grid containing star bases, planets, suns and friendly and enemy ships. All of the Star Trek tropes like phasers, photon torpedoes, warp drive, dilithium mines, black holes, distress calls, view screens and death rays among others are here, albeit under a bit different names. So if you're a fan of the series, you'll quickly form mind-meld strong connections to what's here is what there, and feel right at home. Your ship produces a certain amount of energy, and while it's enough to power most systems when you need them, you have to divide it smartly, and at the time, especially in emergency, you may need more than you'll actually have available. EGA Trek is a fine if very simple looking title, having most of its interface entirely in text mode. But those who are fans of the series will find a lot to like here. Those that do not care for Star Trek, however, may not necessarily get drawn to it. I love Star Trek, so any game even remotely based on its ideas instantly gets an additional score point or two in my books. EGA Trek is no different. If the name Panda Entertainment rings a bell, it's because they were behind Sango Fighter, a popular PC series of versus fighting games. I believe we've covered at least one of them in one of the earlier DOS gaming history videos. Anyway, Tough Guy is another one of their titles, considerably less known though. It's a traditional versus fighting game in which 8 modern-day martial artists from around the world participate in a tournament. And apart from set 8, which all differ considerably in design and the way they play, there are also 4 bosses characters that can only be played against in single player, and cannot be picked in versus mode. One of them, named Walker, is a cybernetic Nazi. Now, that's not something you see often, right? And yes, certain words do not work well with YouTube's algorithm, so are best spelled out. All characters have unique special moves and the game overall is a decent contender against Street Fighter 2. The most notable mechanic in Tough Guy is so-called charge up, which, if opponents give you a second of a breather, allows you to gather up energy that raises both your super meter and health. In 2019, Tough Guy was ported to freeware engine Mugen, and it's available on it free of charge. I'm not sure if the original devs know about it or not, but that's what happened. The main difference between the two versions being the ability to pick 3 of the boss characters in versus mode, with 4th being a secret unlock. One could say that Tough Guy rode the wave of popularity of Street Fighter 2, or even more so SNK games, and perhaps it did, but it doesn't mean that it was a game that couldn't stand on its own. It's a decent fighter and one that's fun even today. Triplane Turmoil is one of the simplest looking, most basic in its gameplay design and overall playing games in this video. It's also one of the best games that 1996 spawned. A game that looks like nothing special, but hides a dark secret. And that secret is that it's probably one of the best multiplayer experiences not only of 1996, but also on DOS overall. In theory, in Triplane Turmoil, you're to fly a World War I style triplane in a hypothetical scenarios for either England, Germany, Japan or Finland, in 5 mission campaigns for each country. But believe me, if you have anyone else with you that's willing to play old games, you can skip the single player mode entirely. It's okay, but not groundbreaking and definitely not what the game is best at. Where Triplane Turmoil spread its, and it's a bad pun warning, wings, is couch multiplayer, where even up to 4 players can compete against each other in a series of simultaneous 4-player dogfights in high resolution on a screen split in 3 to fit all the planes and the overwhelming hectic action. It's pure fun, arcade but skill-based romp where the best always wins. It favors skill over blind shooting and flying. For instance, in some combat scenarios, when flying towards the enemy plane, it may be worth to cut the engines to fool the opponent to fly over you, just to kick them back on again a moment later and attack the enemy from behind. And it's just one of many fun tactics that this game allows for. On the surface, it's incredibly basic, but the execution of the multiplayer in Triplane Turmoil is just perfect, especially if you manage to play it against 3 others. If you don't, it's fun against a single friend too, just not as blood pressure raising. Powerdrome is a sci-fi futuristic racer. It features 6 different half-pipe tracks full of various hazards like chicanes, tunnels and crusher gates to name a few. Each of the planets you race on has a different atmosphere and weather conditions, which you need to account for preparing for the race by using appropriate engine filters. Shifting conditions during gameplay may even require you to hit the pit stop and make changes mid-race. Powerdrome is one of those games that demands patience and a lot of training. A lot. Which understandably may be too much to ask for some, especially in 2023. But it's ultimately worth it if you persist till you get good. Get good. And what I'm trying to say here is that the mouse controls are beyond difficult when you first start playing. And it's not unusual to just bounce left and right seemingly without any way to center your speeder before you master them. But as the saying goes, practice makes perfect, and it's true in case of Powerdrome too. If you keep playing, getting that atomic in size bit better with each game, eventually you'll be able not only to stay on the track but also overtake opponents not only on either of the sides of their speeder, but also over and under them, draining that afterburner dry. Powerdrome is definitely not a game for everyone, partly why it's so little known I think, but it's also one that has a lot to offer if approached with the right mindset. Darklands is probably one of, if not the most ambitious and best game that's criminally overlooked and underrated by most DOS gamers. Also probably most broken. It was one of the most bug-ridden and terribly programmed games to ever come out, and it's not easy to challenge Bethesda in that. They are, after all, masters of buggy games. Anyway, the first release of Darklands had a coding issue in it that could even potentially corrupt system files on users' hard drive. It was obviously fixed with re-release, but bad taste prevailed it seems, and the game never received recognition it deserved. Darklands takes place in a Roman Holy Empire's territory of medieval Germany, and it's represented in unprecedented detail in over 90 cities, calendar system, currency and even weapon and armor types being historically correct. The character creator is one of the most interesting ones I've seen to date too. After choosing name, gender and your social status, you pick your initial occupation, which adds corresponding skill points but also 5 years to your age. And you can keep adding more careers for as long as you'd like, each adding more and more skill points and years to your character. So it's a balancing act of finding a suitable middle ground between the strength and experience. Additionally, magic is substituted with alchemy and you can brew pretty much any and all potions you'd like, given you're actually proficient enough to do so. Enemies and monsters that you'll face are all based on accurate at the time mythos in the region, so dragons, demons and witches may be something that you'll be facing at some point in one form or another. Darklands is non-linear and completely open-ended, which is noticeable from the get-go as your party of 4 starts in an inn in randomly chosen city and not a predefined location. And while your main goal theoretically is to defeat Demon Lord Baphomet and amass a lot of fame, funny enough quantified as a number, even after you do so and watch the ending sequence, you can jump straight back in and carry on adventuring, completing quests and collecting experience. In its current form, patched and fixed, Darklands is an amazing experience that all fans of role-playing games should at least give a chance, as it will no doubt surprise them with its depth and fun factor. City Beneath the Surface is a first-person fantasy role-playing with real-time combat. 4 years after the end of the war between orc invaders and the alliance composed of humans, dwarves and elves, a suspicious portal opened near the kingdom's capital, and with its arrival, at first all the most powerful warriors and mages in the land were slain in their sleep by a mysterious unknown force, Then all means of deadly, bloodthirsty monsters and creatures started pouring out of it, polluting the land with their unholy presence. The king, being the crown-wearing big boy that he was, decided to send the party to reconnaissance the portal and what's on the other side. Who's the leader of the invading forces and what are they actually after? And you, my dear viewer, lead said party of adventurers. Your group is composed out of 4 characters that can be one of 5 races and 4 classes. And while the game offers few pre-generated parties, it's obviously advisable to create your own. City Beneath the Surface is your typical dungeon crawler, with 30 of these to clean out of any and all enemies and monsters, avoiding traps and solving occasional simple puzzles. Even though the game is pretty decent and quite enjoyable for what it is pretty obvious why it never gained critical acclaim. 1998, when it came out, was not a year for grid-based dungeon crawlers. We were all about free movement, full 3D dungeons, and it didn't look as if it was going to change anytime soon. Oxyd was originally released as shareware, and this may be the deciding factor for its obscurity. But it doesn't speak to the game's quality, which in fact is quite exceptional. It's an action puzzler which feels like a cross between Marble Madness and, let's say, Chip's Challenge. The game is composed out of 200 levels called landscapes, in which you have to find all the titular Oxyd stones and open them. Each of them come in the same pattern or color and must be touched in the correct sequence in order to remain open. Naturally, they're not all there just for the taking, and they're scattered over a large area earlier mentioned landscape, usually not in easy to access and remote parts of it. Uncover a pair and it stays open, uncover all pairs and the landscape is completed. It's similar to memory-like game in this matter. But there are also numerous environmental features like walls, pitfalls, quicksand, one-way walls, breakable tiles, reflecting lasers, movables, doors, switches and tiles that can only be rolled over once and then they crumble. And that's just some of them. If you add various different objects that can be picked up and used to give you special abilities and hints, it makes for a really interesting and playable game. Oxyd is challenging but features very well thought out progression curve, allowing you to learn all the ropes as you go without overwhelming you with all of that at once. Every 10th level there's a sort of bonus meditation stage, which is a nice palette cleaner from all the puzzling. Oxyd is great, and if you like puzzlers at least a little, you should check it out. In the last Obscure Games video we spoke about Archon Ultra, a modern remake of classic Archon. A brilliant in its simplicity title really. Today we'll talk about Dark Legions, an action strategy which for all intents and purposes could be summarized as Archon Ultra Ultra. And why is it that you may wonder? Well, it was released by the same publisher, SSI, best known for their numerous strategy and role-playing series, which arguably Archon and Dark Legions are not really representatives of. Well, maybe partially strategy, as they're both sort of board games not unlike chess. And they're both identical gameplay-wise. Meaning that the strategy layer takes place on a board where each side is composed of numerous pawns that represent various creatures and units, all of them different not only in looks but also in what their capabilities and stats are. When 2 opposing units meet on the board, the game moves to a separate arena where they fight in real-time combat. Same as in Archon, the winner is not solely defined by the chosen units but also by players' skill level. Unlike Archon, however, Dark Legions is more advanced and enhanced for more varied and entertaining gameplay. At the start of the game, each side purchases units for a predefined number of credits, and they can pick and choose from any of the 16 available ones. It's not difficult to guess that in most games players will gravitate towards these that they learn to operate best in real-time combat and try to manage their budget around them. So picking and matching of your faves or good counters against what enemy may pick is a must and half of fun. There's a story to Dark Legions, one of 2 orbs of power, which one is seemingly lost, and 2 powerful magic wielders, each having one fight against each other for the control of the second orb, as whomever controls both is granted immense power and immortality, apparently, but I've been born with 2 orbs and they neither hold any real power nor they grant immortality. Although I think I've still a few years left to test that second part out. But story is not something I or you should care about in Dark Legions, because while it's there, you quickly forget about it playing the game and having fun. As in most cases of versus games, it's best played against another person and not CPU. So if you have someone to play it with, then for one I envy you, and for two you'll have a great time. Nomad, aka Project Nomad, is one of the most overlooked and forgotten titles of entire DOS era. It's a space trading, exploration, diplomacy and combat game not unlike Starflight or Elite, but with more interesting and deep plot. Essentially, an alien ship crash landed on Earth, accidentally giving us hyperdrive technology and an information about upcoming evil alien Borg-like race of Korok that's bent on destruction of all life in the universe. Upon learning that, you decide to join the Space Alliance and help them fight the Korok. So you travel around space, composed of approximately 270 planets, meet alien races, trade with them and uncover the mysteries of your ship and evil Koroks. You'll also defend your ship against attackers, fighting in action-based space combats. While Nomad is very story-driven, featuring many scripted conversations and a lot of information gathering, the game is really non-linear and doesn't make you follow one and only path to its conclusion. So you can as well follow the plot straight to the end, or immerse yourself in this world, exploring it, upgrading your ship and fulfilling many missions that the Alliance will post for you to complete. Nomad is one of those games that if I knew of back then, I would have seriously fell for it and spent hundreds if not thousands hours playing it till there would be no more content left in it. And if you like games like that, this one's one of the best there is, even if it's largely completely unknown. You're one of the 3 officers manning the space station beacon stupidly named 04523N, and manning is a big word as in reality you're asleep. All 3 of you are in fact in cryogenic suspension as the station manages itself entirely on its own, only waking the crew when either there's an emergency or for routine checks. With a long yawn and the alarm signal ringing in your ears, you're violently awakened as some unknown life form seemingly approaches the space station. Wreckers is an isometric sci-fi action game with some very superficial strategy elements. Your main task in it is to defend the station and rid of an alien invaders as soon as possible. Because if at any point in time station will detect foreign life forms on it for any longer than an hour, a self-destruct sequence will be initiated. From my point of view, it's a terrible misjudgment and a bad station design, but not everyone is graduate of Starfleet Academy same as I am, and had to tackle with various difficult design scenarios before being granted the name of multidimensional intergalactic master of space station design and superior ultra smart well of incredible ideas. And that's me, you can look me up in Starfleet records. Coming back to our station, any bacteria or fungal infection could be considered an alien life form. What about pets like cats and dogs? Would the station blow itself out too if detected any of these? I would have never allowed for such design to leave my office. Never mind, you're controlling one of the 3 officers fighting the titular wreckers, which come in swarms of plasmodian spores invading station's 4 sections. You can suck the spores out space with a gigantic hoover-like space hose. When they settle on the hull, you'll need to get in your spacesuit and spray infected areas with a cleansing agent. And spores found in station's corridors have to be shot down with plasma beams, all the while avoiding being shot yourself. Additionally, at any given moment you're in control of few droids which are largely capable of acting independently if sent to an area where you want them to act, and they can be assigned to be cleaners, engineers or even fighters. In time, as you progress through the game, you'll gain experience and higher ranks, which in turn will enable you to construct more efficient droids in your factory. So the main goal of Wreckers is to dispose of all the alien spores so that the space station could continue working uninterrupted. Wreckers is not a game I knew about back in the day, and it's definitely one that's worth trying out. 1989 gave us one of those sci-fi movies that were so bad that they ended up being pretty damn good. Robot Jox, a futuristic story of East versus West where there's no regular war anymore and all the conflicts between both blocks are solved with use of giant mechs operated by pilots, the titular Robot Jox. I don't wanna say that One Must Fall 2097 is based on that movie, but it kinda looks like it. With a slight difference, One Must Fall 2097 is actually pretty good and very innovative. What is so special about it then? Well, it's a versus fighter with all encounters taking place in gigantic cage-like arenas. The twist being that you can choose one of 10 pilot characters and control one of huge mechs, mixing and matching them together to form the best combo possible. Both characters and robots can be improved between the fights, role-playing style, and despite that it may seem like unnecessary addition, it actually adds a lot to the fun factor and is the main reason I'm so surprised that One Must Fall was not more popular. I'm pretty sure that not only then, but even today there are no versus fighting games that would allow for really game-changing upgrades as the game carries on. Oh, and it also features finishing moves, unlike those in Mortal Kombat, so there's that too. If you like fighting games and never played One Must Fall, I can pretty much guarantee that it's one of the most original and unusual games that you've ever had your paws on. Toasty! Invasion of the Mutant Space Bats of Doom is not only the single most epically named game I can recall, but also a really fun shareware shoot 'em up. And it's the fact that it was released as shareware that contributes to its obscurity. While the story as in most shoot 'em ups is as cliché as you can imagine it to be, the opening introduction is full of fun and quirky B-movie tropes of the 60s. Graphically and sound-wise, Invasion is nothing special. Really, everything is just right, but doesn't stand out in any way from hundreds of other shooters. But in terms of gameplay, it's just pure fun. It's hard to say why, as it doesn't do anything that others haven't done before, but it all just fits well together and presents itself as a complete and enjoyable package. And in that it kinda reminds me of Deluxe Galaga on Amiga. which also did not feature flashy presentation, but more than made up for it with gameplay. Deluxe Galaga is obviously better than Invasion, but it's hardly a surprise as there's perhaps 1 or 2 games that I'd consider to be equal or superior to it. Coming back to Invasion though, it is composed out of 21 levels in the shareware version and 65 in the registered one, which in both cases is pretty solid as there were multiple other games released back in the day that sold as full-fledged releases and had less stages than Invasion has in its shareware outing. It features a simple but easy to understand upgrade system based on picking up gems that fall from defeated enemies. Green gems increase the shot speed, white increase the damage, red improve your rate of fire, blue slow the game down for a little while, and if you collect 6 purple gems, you granted an additional life. Oh, and it goes without saying that all the enemies you'll face are some form of the titular space bats. If there's one thing that you should take out of everything I just said, is that if you're at all into the genre, Invasion is definitely a hidden gem that you ought to track down and add to your collection. Now this is going to be a tough one, as Manhunter New York is not the easiest of games to describe while also giving it justice. But if I was to simplify it to the very basic genre it represents, I'd say it's Sierra's point-and-click adventure with some action segments here and there. The game is set in post-apocalyptic New York in the far-off future of 2004. Yep, when it released in 1988, 2004 seemed like a lifetime away. Anyway, 2 years prior, in 2002, the Earth has been enslaved by the alien force known only as the Orbs, who look suspiciously similar to simplified beholders from AD&D. They've implanted all humans with tracking devices, forced them to wear nondescript boring brown bag-looking robes and forbid them from speaking. I know a person or two who could have benefited from such order, but that's beside the point. You play as the titular Manhunter, one of the chosen few to be the judge, jury and executioner working for the Orbs, and you're sent to track down humans who are suspected to be forming an underground resistance. As the game progresses, you uncover that the Orbs are actually harvesting human organs and treat the planet as quote-unquote gigantic farm, upon which they cultivate humans as food that they later on consume. And it is when you realize what's what and switch sides to overthrow the evil rulers. Manhunter is definitely not a game for kids. Dark and often gory visuals contrast with Sierra's other colorful fairy tale-like adventure games, and the use of first-person perspective and point-and-click interface adds a lot to the gritty post-apocalyptic atmosphere. Especially that the game takes place in New York and you get to visit many true-to-life locations and landmarks. Manhunter is something all fans of adventure games should at least try to approach and see if they like it, cause if they do, they're in for a unique adventure and story unlike many. Jill of the Jungle is the first title in trilogy of shareware action platformer games designed by legendary Tim Sweeney and released by Epic Mega Games. While Jill never gained acclaim and popularity as huge as his later Unreal shooters did, it's still a pretty fun and well-executed game. It features 14 levels and their typical platforming fare where you control titular eponymous Jill, fighting various monsters such as snails, frogs, piranhas and giant ants to name a few, and solving simple puzzles to advance further. You're armed with a knife and spinning blade, and they're your best friends in those monster-filled lands. Some levels may feature parts that will require Jill to change forms, and she can transform into a fish that can swim in the water, bird that can fly, or a frog that has a considerably higher jump than Jill does. All of these can shoot same way our heroine does. You'll obviously need to collect keys to advance and avoid environmental dangers like spikes or even water if you're not in your fish form. Jill was a transitional game across Gen 1, I'd risk saying, as it came out supporting both VGA graphics and Sound Blaster sound, and in the same time it could be run using EGA and even lowly and ugly CGA for much reduced but still playable experience. The only thing I could really pick on would be that aside from Sound Blaster, it only supported PC speaker, so you could either experience the absolute top quality sound and music available on PC, or absolute worse, with literally no options in between. Weird choice, but I suppose that there had to be a reason for it. We will never know. All in all, Jill of the Jungle is a very competent and decently fun game that all fans of the platforming genre should at the very least try, as it may surprise them with its playability, even if it was never as popular as it could have been if it was released as a standalone title with a proper publisher backing and ads. Vette is a racing/simulation game putting Chevrolet Corvette at the forefront and taking place on streets of San Francisco. In fact, in game's 3D flat-shaded presentation, a big part of the city is recreated within the confines of the game as close as it was possible given the tech available at the time, and many of the famous San Francisco landmarks are represented quite faithfully. Golden Gate Bridge, Bay Bridge and Fisherman's Wharf to name a few. 4 Corvettes are available to choose from: stock 89 Corvette, ZR1, Calway's Twin Turbo and Sledgehammer. And opponents drive 4 European cars: Porsche 928, Lamborghini Countach, Ferrari F40 and Testarossa. Another thing that comes in force in that is the number of courses to race on. But if you're not in the mood for a challenge, you can just tour the city in aptly named Tour mode. While you race, since it's within the confines of the city, you may be pulled over by cops, and unless you've hit or run over a pedestrian, it's not a game over. You can pick from a whole list of excuses to convince the cop to let you go. And believe it or not, but they sometimes work. It's worth keeping in mind that your car is susceptible to damage, which in turn influences its engine power and handling. You can have it fixed at one of the many gas stations in the city though. I should really question why it's the gas stations that offer repair services, but I blame it all on game's logic, that allows for adding anything to the game that designers' imagination can spawn. At the time of its release, that was praised by the few gaming mags that covered it for its unprecedented realism of both driving and dashboards of all 4 Corvettes. It's not a groundbreaking game or best racer out there, so don't approach it with this mindset and too high expectations, but it's decent, and unlike anything else racer, that's design-wise closer to likes of Stunt Car Racer and Stunts rather than Need for Speed and Lotus series of games. God of Thunder is a tough nut to crack. Not because he's a god, though that may be a contributing factor too, but because it's a mishmash. On one hand, it looks and sounds very simple for the time, and there isn't anything presentation-wise worth remembering. But on another, it features pretty good story and stellar gameplay loop, mixing various genres in unforgettable experience. Odin, the highest of Norse gods, goes into deep slumber periodically. During one of those so-called Odin sleeps, god of mischief Loki stole Odin's favorite land, Midgard, and populated it with various unimaginable monstrosities. You, as Odin's true son Thor, with use of your magic hammer have to travel to Midgard, reclaim it for your father and face Loki and his forces. The game is a mixture of adventuring with some simple role-playing, not unlike original Zelda on NES, with a touch of platforming. Those platforming sections are viewed from a side perspective, while most of the game is in bird's eye view. On your adventure you'll face many monsters, fighting them in action combat using your hammer or lightning attacks. But most of all, you'll be solving puzzles. And these can range from very small and easy ones, to those that take up a whole screen and can prove challenging even for seasoned Logic Games fans. Still, in its heart, God of Thunder is an action-adventure, so if you like those kinds of games and can overlook a bit underwhelming presentation, there's a lot of fun to be had here. Hugo's House of Horrors is the first title in Hugo's own trilogy, and like most games we spoke about today, a shareware title. It only goes to prove that while easier for the designer to publish without the need for a big publisher, shareware games had much smaller reach, and eventually many of them fell into obscurity. Oh, and it may be obvious by now since you're watching the video, but Hugo is not the Hugo you thought of. Or at least it wasn't the Hugo I thought of when I heard about this game. I imagined that horned trolley thingy that was often featured on TV in the late 80s and early 90s, in shows where you could dial in with your digital phone and play to win games. At least that's what we had here. Still, it's not the one, so let's let him rest in his CRT TV-shaped coffin in peace. This Hugo is an adventure game controlled with a mixture of arrow-based movement and typed-in commands. So a text parser. Oh man, how I hate those. Anyway, your sweetheart Penelope has disappeared in mysterious circumstances after visiting a seemingly haunted house on her babysitting job. So in order to find and rescue her, you need to head to the haunted mansion and explore it, all areas around and beneath it, and solve various puzzles. And those range quite considerably from inventory puzzles that require smart use of items you find around the house, through ones that are agility based and see you navigating your character carefully around a certain area, to those that will straight up test your knowledge. How does Hugo's House of Horrors compare to games in the genre by Sierra and even more so LucasArts? Well, while it's not a bad game in no sense of the word, there's no comparison really. It's not that they're in different quality leagues, they don't even play the same sport. The difference is monumental and there's no mistaking which of the titles is shareware if you compare the three. Interestingly enough, if you purchase full version of Hugo, you not only get 2 other episodes completing the trilogy, but also an automatic solver that plays the whole game like a movie. So there's that. Omnicron Conspiracy is a zany, light-hearted adventure set in a far-off future. You're Ace Powers, a star police captain, and you're assigned the task of investigating an intergalactic drug ring. You learn quickly that the previous cop assigned to the task has gone missing, so you must pick up the trail and solve the case yourself. I realize that nothing of what I just said sounds fun, but believe me, Omnicron Conspiracy is full of offbeat moments, more or less hidden jokes, and humorous interactions. While it's not point and click per se, as the controls are keyboard based, it's not far off. There's no commands to type in anywhere, and when you're in vicinity of an object or character you'd like to interact with, press enter and a list of available actions will appear. They're context based, so there's hardly ever going to be more than 3 at a time. Your inventory can hold up to 6 items at once, and they must be used to either solve puzzles that will help you advance in your investigation, or more often than not, for comedic purposes. It's worth noting that one of the items in the game is a laser gun that can be set to stun or kill, and it should never leave one of your inventory slots as it will come in handy quite often. While the gameplay itself feels rather linear, finding clues and following the investigation is fun, even if at times feeling a bit slow. Since there's around 250 locations to visit, literally hundreds of characters to talk to and interact with, and the game overall is huge and filled with humor to the brim, if you like adventure games, especially those with addictive properties, you're gonna love Omnicron Conspiracy. Vinyl Goddess from Mars seems to have a lot of similarities with earlier title we spoke about, Jill of the Jungle. And not for no reason, as it was originally planned as a sequel to it. Mid-development, however, Epic Mega Games dropped it, opting for just Jackrabbit instead. Vinyl Goddess was picked by another developer and publisher and completed, eventually releasing in 1995. Story-wise, our leather-wearing over-sexualized heroine is on her way to an intergalactic B-movie convention when a sudden meteor shower throws her spaceship off its original course. She crash lands on an unknown mysterious planet on which you take control of our heroine and must help her find and repair her ship, gather all her belongings and get to the convention in time. I know, story leaves a bit to be desired, but when did the story in a platformer ever was important? Oh, you're right, Flashback and Prince of Persia are great examples of when. But let's just get back to the agenda and leave the plot aside. The game is a side-scrolling platformer, and as you might have already guessed, the first episode is released as shareware and the remaining 2 are unlocked upon registration/purchase. The game offers quite a few weapons to choose from, with daggers, shurikens, fireballs and flaming oil being among them. Enemies are quite varied too and much more difficult than in Jail. And in general, Vinyl Goddess feels like a much more demanding Jail with a better presentation. Is it a better game overall? Not necessarily, but it's not inherently a bad one. Despite the title, in Crime Fighter you don't take a role of a police officer or a vigilante. Quite the opposite in fact. You're a rookie gangster aiming to become a big deal. The game is played for points and money, and it's these 2 factors that decide upon your position within the underworld hierarchy. And for all intents and purposes, Crime Fighter is a board game played in turns for up to 4 players. The board is divided into sections, each of representing important to the gameplay locations like bank or police station to name a few, and your main task is to commit as many crimes as possible to climb the underworld ladder. You obviously should start small with burglaries and theft, and eventually will progress to more demanding bank and train raids. All the actions that you can take are resolved using different minigames, which at first seem like a breath of fresh air, but quickly become repeatable and underwhelming. Crime Fighter is a fun game if played with friends once every Halley Comet's passing, so not very often, but from time to time, when you're in a mood for a classic unlike most, it's a good choice to fire up and get lost in a criminal underground. The cover of Big Red Racing says it all. It's adrenaline-fueled, action-packed, cool Mario Kart-like racer with a touch of off-road and bits and pieces borrowed from another racing games. It's the Sonic the Hedgehog of racers. It's cool, rad, hype and whatever else you would have called it back in the day. But most of all, it's actually really fun. It features 24 entirely unique tracks, each of having distinctive look and feel, and each of offering 2 vehicles to choose from. There's many more obviously, and they can be really crazy and unexpected, like spaceships, snowmobiles, jeeps, helicopters and hovercrafts to name a few, but there is always only 2 to pick between for each race. All of them allow for in-cockpit view or a wide selection of behind-the-vehicle cameras, so that everyone can play the game the way they like best. And while the vehicles themselves don't look especially great in these early 3D titles, and tracks could use a bit more variety in terms of what's around them in the background, the game itself is a riot. And you're not gonna get bored or feel as if there was something missing or the game lacked content. Big Red Racing is hella fun and an excellent example of a game that grew old well, and is as playable today as it was over 25 years ago. Oh, and obviously Big Red Racing features a whole plethora of multiplayer options over modem and network too, but where it shines is its split screen mode where you can enjoy it with or against a friend same way you would have Mario Kart. But faster, crazier, and most of all in a very varied form, where each next track plays entirely different than the one before. Big Red Racing is one of those games that would have really benefited from a modern reimagination with polished presentation and sounds and release on Xbox Game Pass for instance, where it would have quickly become a hit. Crime Does Not Pay is an arcade adventure where you can lead a Chinese or Italian crime family, controlling 3 of its most important members: a godfather that you take direct control of, an assassin, and a deadly young woman with an ultimate goal of having one of them elected as a mayor. Makes you wonder how come there's a Chinese mafia included and not Yakuza, right? Oh well, we'll never know. Anyway, the task is easier said than done, so you'll be bribing or blackmailing police chiefs, judges, bankers and your opponents. You'll fight off assassins sent against you, engage in shootouts with the police, all the while making sure that the money is flowing to bankroll your big ambitions. Each of the 3 members has a certain amount of health and 5 pockets, for the lack of a better word, to store and carry items, cash and anything else that may come in handy. Stuff like ammo, safe codes or incriminating evidence against important town figures among others. All 3 have different set of abilities too, and those need to be utilized appropriately, all the while making sure that you don't fall a victim to one of your opponents. We're most used to crime/mafia games being strategies or management titles, and Crime Does Not Pay is neither. It's a fresh take on a subject and it's a welcome change. That said, the game is very slow to start and may initially seem, well, boring. But if you give it time, it's actually pretty fun to complete it. Once. I see no reason to do it again, really. And not because it's a bad game, it's just when you complete it, you'll pretty much experience everything it has to offer along the way. Dawn Raider is a top-down vertically scrolling shooter where you control an assault craft fighting through 14 stages of a foreign country's land. Your plane is armed with missiles, machine gun or laser. That last one accessible by holding the fire button down, that then transforms your machine gun into it. Before entering a new stage, you always have to defeat some kind of a huge-ass enemy, usually nearly half-screen in size, and they all have one thing in common. They've been made out of sponges, as you have to sink seemingly bajillions of bullets and rockets in them before you even make a dent or any noticeable damage. Interestingly enough, the oil meter is actually your health, so with each hit that you take it will deplete a little, to eventually have you crash when it's down to 0. The enemies drop missiles, oil cans and laser power cells, which you can use to power your 3 weapons. Dawn Raider's presentation when speaking about both graphics and sound design is average, a definition of middle of the road for the time. It's not good enough that you'd want to talk about it after playing, and not so bad that it would detract from playing. And sometimes any publicity is good publicity, so even an extremely bad presentation could be better than something so average that it's forgettable. I mean, take a look at Pro Soccer 2190 on the Amiga. I keep coming back to it in like every 3rd or 4th video, but you'll never ever find me playing it again. That's how bad it is. But it lives on engraved in my memory forever. Anyway, Dawn Raider's best feature, as per usual in the genre, is its simultaneous 2-player mode, and that's how it should be experienced. Quick the Thunder Rabbit is an action platformer, and while it may seem very generic following the traditional platforming tropes known from consoles, like getting from start to the end of the level left to right, platforming your way through and fighting off numerous baddies, Quick is actually quite fun. You battle your way against hordes of over-the-top cute creatures by turning yourself into a rolling ball, Sonic-like, smashing into them. Doing so, however, depletes your water and food reserves, which you need to refill by eating carrots and drinking water. You also get to collect hearts to refill your energy and 2 differently colored potions to enhance your skills. Red allows you to jump higher, while green speeds up you considerably. When using the latter, you're indestructible for a little while, or until you hit a wall. Keep that in mind. In some levels, all you need to do is find the exit, which I must add more often than not is straight as an arrow, all the way to the right. In others, you need to find the clock, which usually is within a sub-level, with door to it hidden somewhere in the main one. And since we're on a subject, the levels are huge and beautiful. Same as the rest of the presentation actually. And Quick, given how it looks and sounds and most importantly plays, should have been a much more popular title than it ever was. I mean, it's those little touches that make a huge difference, the variety of enemies, small bits of animations here and there, like main character's idle stance or face for instance. They really didn't need to be animated for the game to play as well as it does, but that seemingly insignificant change makes for a much more enjoyable package. Quick is a very polished product and probably one game worth most of your attention out of all included in this video. Flip-Out is an interesting take on Arkanoid. For all intents and purposes, the gameplay mechanics are identical, with paddle at the bottom and destructible elements on top of the screen. But there are some slight but noticeable changes to the formula. Namely, some elements seem to have been borrowed from pinball games. The destructible elements are not rectangular blocks anymore, but are of various shapes, and the game field is also filled with indestructible walls, placed at different angles. It all adds to randomness of ball's behavior and is a fresh take on the formula. Same as in Arkanoid, your goal is to clean the screen of all destructible objects. But unlike in the original, there's no lives in Flip-Out, and that's because the game is composed out of full screen stages. each level built out of 3 of these, and you always start on the third, so the topmost one. You can fall down to clear the bottom 2, but have to be careful not to drop down from the bottom one, as it's game over. Conveniently, each of the screens is initially blocked off with destructible blocks so that the ball would not fall through too early. I mean, who would have wanted their balls to fall through too early, right? Anyway, while the idea behind flip-out sloop is interesting and could prove for really fun and long-lasting gameplay, sadly there's no power-up pickups falling out of destroyed objects. It may not be a game-breaking issue for most, but for me it's too big of an omission to fully enjoy the game. Also, and that's worth pointing out, whenever I look at the ball's movement I get a strong beach ball vibes, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. It just doesn't seem to move like either Arkanoid or Pinball. Let me start by pointing out that whomever drew the title screen for Framed never saw human hands, or had been a victim of terrible, crippling accident. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry. I mean, take a look at it, and then grab something, anything that could have resembled a bar that the character on it is holding. There's no physical way that your hands would ever look like it, because we have opposing thumbs. Okay, I may be a bit too salty here, so I'll let it slide from now on. So, Framed is a side-scrolling adventure platformer, with an emphasis on adventuring, featuring a deep plot, 16 slots large inventory and a whole plethora of logical and mechanical puzzles, some of which will require you to combine carried items to solve them. In fact, there's a lot of actions that you can take, from picking up of objects through examining to combining them among others. So it's worth to familiarize yourself with controls before playing, as they're a bit on a more complicated side. While the game features weapons and ammunition, it's entirely possible to avoid shooting enemies. Don't know if it's important for an everyday gamer, but those who like to challenge themselves or speedrun games could attempt that kind of a playthrough. Framed starts with you in jail where you've landed and not because of your own fault. And during the course of the game you have to escape from it and then prove your innocence. A bit cliché, but overall fun plot to immerse yourself in. Bloodnet is a cyberpunk point-and-click adventure with some role-playing elements, and it's a truly weird game. On one hand, it takes place in a far-off future that's full of futuristic cyberpunk overtones and grim atmosphere, and on another, the game's filled with overarching occultist vampire themes. If it sounds like an odd combination, that's good, cause it is. But most importantly, it's an amazing dark adventure that feels at times more like a movie that you partake in and can influence the outcome of than the game. Despite complex puzzles and oppressive mood that's spilling from the screen by the bucket, Bloodnet has a powerful and deep plot that's perfectly paced and serving overwhelming A-class storytelling all throughout, especially during dialogues that are a definite highlight of the title, working as both a tool to learn about Ransom Stark, your character, and his motivations, and as a comedic relief, at times feeling as if their dry humor was out of place in the dystopian reality of the game. Story-wise, you've befallen with terrible syndrome, lost your job and home. But luckily, as everything was going down the drain, you were saved by an ingenious woman who implanted you with a prototype brain chip. It's an oversimplification, but I'm working on a limited time here, folks, so forgive me. All that just to be bitten by a vampire a little while later. Bitten, changed and feeling unlike yourself, all you want to do is to rid Manhattan of vampires and their evil leader Abraham Van Helsing. And with help of your chip, struggling to keep your humanity, save yourself from eventually becoming one too. Bloodnet's controls are not great, but given how amazing the rest of the game is, they're worth the pain, just to experience this incredible adventure from beginning to the end. Horror Zombies from the Crypt is a platform game heavily inspired by the 1950s and 60s B-movie horrors, and full of tropes found in these. You play as Count Frederick Valdemar and have to traverse through 6 levels of a mansion in search for schools. You gotta collect them all before you get to move to the next stage. If the game was all about picking schools only, however, it would be both simple and boring. So obviously the mansion throws heaps of enemies at you. Well, not the mansion itself, but they're there and they're out to get you. And this can be any and all ghastly creatures well known from books and movies of the genre, so anything from zombies and mummies, through vampires and werewolves, all the way to the Grim Reapers. You have to find keys to open locked doors too, and have a weapon to kill the baddies. It's just a knife, but when there's nothing better around, a knife will have to do. Even if it's a butter knife, cause properly aimed butter knife is as dangerous as the spoon. Regardless how insignificant spoons feel. In the right or more likely wrong hands, a spoon can be a weapon to be wary of. Let John Wick movies to be testament to that. Horror Zombies graphics are not the best, but they're good representation of an average for platformers on DOS in 1990. They're colorful and generally speaking not bad, but the animation is a bit jerky, with jumps feeling especially unresponsive, and enemy death animations having what seems just like 2 or 3 frames. It doesn't detract from playing, but is definitely noticeable. Sounds are. Yes, that's all I have to say about them. They are in the game. But I suppose you got to quote-unquote appreciate their pedestrian quality by now. All in all, Horror is not a bad game, and fans of platformers would definitely enjoy completing it. Would others do? I don't know, you tell me. Rotox is a top-down futuristic sci-fi action shooter. You play as former Lieutenant Kowalski, a mercenary from the Solar Exploration Corps who was mortally wounded and saved in a cyborg research facility by a conversion into a cyborg called Rotox. Basically, your Robocop scenario, but in a more far-off future. Your goal is simple: to exterminate any and all mechanical units in each level. These are divided into smaller 9 sections that are not linked with each other. The action is fast and frantic, and there's a lot of enemies to put down on each level. Thankfully, additional weapons are available for pickup throughout the game, so you should always have something to blast away the mechanical scum with. When all enemies are gone, the screen flashes, letting you know that you can move to the next sector. The first few levels are quite easy, letting you accommodate to a bit fiddly controls, but the further you go, the more demanding the game will become, eventually ending up being pretty tough. Rotox is presented in a top-down view with 3D rotoscope landscape, and the mixture of rotation and vector with sprite-based graphics makes up for an impressive for the time presentation, at least in VGA mode. EGA and CGA are rather horrible. Would I recommend Rotox today? It's hard to tell. Fans of shooters would definitely find something here to enjoy, but I'm not sure about others. The rotation gimmick may not be enough to keep them interested all throughout, you know. Wild Wheels feels like a mixture of classic speedball with modern Rocket League. So it's a sort of a football/soccer game with car destruction mechanics Frankensteined on top of it. The game basically is a series of elimination matches with the goal to defeat increasingly more difficult opponents and win all leagues. The rules are simple: you and your 4 CPU-controlled teammates have to bring the ball to the opposing team's goal, same as in Rocket League. But unlike in the aforementioned, points are not awarded for the goals only, but also for destroying enemy cars. And you gotta be careful about that, as same as theirs, your car can be put out of commission too. And it doesn't really take that much beating to have it totaled. The points can be spent between the matches to replace your team's cars with better ones, with higher stats and suited for specific on-field roles for an added layer of strategy. The camera can be placed in various positions, with the behind the car one being obviously most comfortable for playing. And there's 2 modes of control: Professional, when the car rotates when pressing left or right, and Arcade, which allows for direct turns. Whichever you pick, however, they will take a little while to get used to before they become a second nature. So if you're an impatient person, the game may not be for you. If you're patient, however, and master them eventually, you may grow tired of generally speaking repeatable gameplay loop along the way. But I suppose same could be said about any sports game. Circuit's Edge is a first-person role-playing with adventure elements in a futuristic cyberpunk setting based on George Alec Effinger's When Gravity Fails novel. It's set in a dark version of the future in which the Islamic religion has overtaken the world and is a dominant power all around. The game takes place in Budayan, the criminal and entertainment district of an unspecified Middle Eastern metropolis. You play as Marit Udran, a private investigator who, similarly to Tex Murphy in later Under a Killing Moon, is out of luck and on the verge of losing everything. So he does whatever possible to scrape every little penny he can, mainly doing petty delivery jobs. During one of those low-paid deliveries, you find your customer dead, and the authorities assume that you're responsible party. For better or worse, a powerful local mafia boss pulls some strings to get you off the hook. In exchange, you're tasked with finding out who's really responsible for the killing. And when you do, a much larger and convoluted scheme will unfold, spanning numerous hours of gameplay. Circuit's Edge is viewed from the first person and for the most part plays like an early dungeon crawlers. It's just based in an entirely different setting. Combat is turn-based and is your main source of income, although you can partake in gambling to supplement your earnings too. Money can be spent on cybernetic implants and modifications to upgrade your character's combat and hacking abilities. Your character needs to eat and rest to stay alive, and I suggest you do too, because you're important. If not to anyone else, then to me. I mean, we get to talk in the comments below from time to time, right? So eat and sleep and stay healthy, okay? Circuit's Edge may not be as good or as iconic as the aforementioned Under a Killing Moon was, but it's an interesting story and the game is quite fun if you're into either RPGs or adventure games. I realize that the series is called Best Obscure Games You've Never Heard Of, but the game I'm going to mention now is pure trash. Only not really, but we'll circle back to it in a moment. The Town with No Name should be called The Game with No Plot. Or even better, MS Paint Western themed drawing tournament for kids ages 5 and below. I mean, just look at it. It's fugly. And I know it would have made for a very long title, but it fits. The aforementioned plot is actually in the game, but it's as bad as you'd expect from an 8-bit platformer and not seemingly cinematic experience that the game was aiming to be. In short, you're a drifter who arrives at the titular town and immediately gets into a shootout with a random cowboy. Unfortunately, after killing him, you learn that he was a younger brother of a local big dog gangster aptly named Evil Ebb. So you spend the rest of the game dismantling Evil Ebb's gang, one sweat-drenched cowboy at the time, in series of shootout scenes. The hitboxes are rather liberal, so you don't have to always hit the enemy directly and can sorta aim more or less in his direction, but even if that's the case, you do have to click to shoot in time. In between the fighting there's quite a few places you get to visit and some cutscenes which, while looking terrible, same as the rest of the game's presentation, are chock full of humorous moments and often odd over-the-top jokes. And all of them, along with the junky gameplay, actually make up for a very enjoyable gaming experience, even if it's not of highest quality. And that's why I said the game is trash, but not really. Because even though weird humor and hilarious animations drew by 5-year-olds may grow old quickly, the whole game can be completed in under an hour, so they never get a chance to. I don't think I've ever recommended a bad game, and Town with No Name is an odd one, as it's a Sharknado of games. Meaning that it's so bad that it's actually really good and worth experiencing just for the sake of seeing everything that's in it. Canton, an Atlas Pathfinder adventure, is not an adventure game at all. In fact, it's rather fun trading management title set in 18th century China. You begin in the city of Canton, today's Guangdong, with a small caravan and a little money to start you off. Kinda similarly to a very well-known entrepreneur who started his empire with a small loan of $1 million. Anyway, to get the money flowing you need to locate another city and start trading with it. There's quite a few goods to trade with and they include grain, meat, salt, ore, weapons and tools. The underlying supply and demand mechanics allow for different demand and prices for goods between different cities and for them to fluctuate as the situation on the market changes. In time you'll be able to purchase more caravans, build warehouses to hold more items and even manufacture some goods of your own, and each caravan obviously costs you in upkeep, in both food and money, but as you progress within the game, in time you'll be able to establish fixed trade routes, reducing the micromanagement considerably. Same as in most great trading games like Vermeer for instance, Canton features quite a few special random events that can have positive or adverse effects on your finances. Outcome of some of them can be influenced by choices that you make, like hiring soldiers to defend your caravans and fend off attacks of robbers successfully. I believe I haven't mentioned yet that the game is played in turns, each representing 1 month of in-game time, and is viewed from the top-down perspective, not unlike the one in First Civilization. I'm a huge fan of turn-based games, so whenever I find one, I tend to give it at least a little attention to see what it's all about. Canton is really fun, and if you manage to track it down or already own a registered version, it will let you play it for decades and sink hours into it. Unregistered shareware version only allows for 60 turns, so 5 years of in-game play, which is way too little to fully appreciate this title. Monster Bash aka Graveyard is a shareware side-scrolling platform game by Apogee Software, and along with Epic they were the grandmasters of the shareware scene in the early 90s. As most titles released via Method, only part of the game is available for free, namely first out of 3 episodes. While the shareware model often meant that the games did not get the recognition they deserved, as they had virtually no advertising budgets at all and only relied on word of mouth and trial versions to promote them. Some, as we know today, did not suffer as much as others did. Commander Keen games, for instance, while never being sold commercially in a standard definition of the term and only as shareware, were very well known and appreciated by gamers even to this day. Monster Bash is sadly not the case, as it never got to even step for a minute into the proverbial limelight, despite being quite good for what it was. You're Johnny Dash, whose pet dog was captured by nefarious Count Chuck, so to get him back, you enter the grim underworld with no more than your trusty slingshot to save Tex, your dog. The game is composed out of 28 horror-themed levels, through which you have to traverse fighting of various monsters like crawling hands, flying witches, zombies, demons, skeletons and werewolves. In each episode you'll also face stronger enemy in the form of your nemesis, so your evil doppelganger. And at the very end, boss monster to defeat. You also get to pick up power-ups, and these can be hearts replenishing your health, or upgrades for your slingshot, including but not limited to more powerful projectiles, larger rocks, missiles and even fireballs. Interestingly enough, your slingshot can also be used for puzzling purposes, for instance to move faraway objects. Rocks themselves move as realistically as it was possible in a shareware game in 1993 and overall bounce off of objects as you'd expect them to. While Monster Bash may not be one of the best platformers for DOS, it's a decent early release and quite fun title if you're into the genre. Cosmo's Cosmic Adventure is another of Apogee's hidden gems. It's a side-scrolling platformer in which you play as titular Cosmo, an alien boy who on his way to Disney World with his parents due to unforeseen comet hitting their spaceship force landed on an unknown planet. During landing the ship is damaged and you have to repair it, so you head off to explore for spare parts. As you come back, however, your parents are kidnapped and the only thing left behind are large footprints. This is where you decide to save them, and this is also where the 3-episode-long game starts. Each episode is composed out of 10 levels. In first, you're in search for your parents, just to be accidentally swallowed by a gigantic creature at the end of it. In second, you search for how to escape the innards of the monstrosity, and then find the city where your parents are seemingly kept. In the final episode, you find them, it seems that they've been in no danger at all, and then you have a time of your life in Disney World celebrating your birthday. Story aside, gameplay is rather simple, and all you have to do in each level is to get to the end of it. You can walk, jump and hang onto most walls, and grand majority of the game will be spent platforming your way utilizing those skills, especially the hang jump, for the lack of a better word, allowing you to get to higher to reach spots. You also interact with different objects like buttons, teleports and springs for higher jumps. Cosmo has 3 health points, allowing him to get hit by enemies 3 times before he loses one of his unlimited lives, but they can be expanded up to a maximum of 5 if you locate cheeseburgers along the way. You don't shoot and have to dispose of enemies either by jumping on their heads Mario style or by using collectible bombs, of which you can carry up to 9 at a time. You gotta be careful with them though, as they have a rather large explosion radius, so after throwing one, it's worth to move away from its reach. Bombs can also be used in some simple environmental puzzling, so it's worth keeping that in mind. While Cosmo's graphics are nothing special, only ever utilizing EGA and a bit clunky animation, the 3-layer parallax scrolling is rather nice. Same can't be said about sounds, which only work with PC speaker. Sure, music is played by Adlib, but the sounds are horrendous. Cosmo is a fun game, especially for the younger audiences, but I'm sure the fans of platformers of any ages would find something to like in it. Dreamweb is probably one of the most unusual adventure games of the time of its release. It was one of the darkest and most atmospheric adventure games played from a rarely utilized in the genre top-down view. Dystopian Dreamweb's future was neither too torn out of our reality to feel alien, nor too close to it to feel as something we could experience in a daily life. It was not quite cyberpunk, but not far off either. Technology-filled, rain-soaked noir game world of Dreamweb is the best testament to developers' inspirations, which most definitely were centered around Blade Runner, which is good, I must add. It is a good team to have in your game. Dreamweb is a mature title full of adult overtones with bloody violence and sexual content all throughout. When it came out, saying that it was shocking and sparked a conversation or two would have been understatement, if not for the fact that it never gained big enough following to do so. It deserved to be discussed, to be a part of the whole ESRB creation along the titles like Mortal Kombat, Snatcher or Doom, but given that it was an adventure title, in a world that was going crazy for the new, so digitized graphics, realistic for the time FPS shooters and FMV games, it was largely ignored. Story-wise, you're essentially visited by an unknown deity in your dreams and instructed to kill 7 important people, all in order to save mankind, as their existence would jeopardize it. So without giving it much thought, you wake up and carry on with the mission, which raises a series of moral questions that the game never tries to answer. Interestingly enough, Dreamweb shares something with Elder Scrolls titles from Bethesda. To be precise, nearly anything in the game can be picked up and carried in inventory, even if its usefulness is questionable or non-existent. Dreamweb was not a title for teens or kids, even if that's most of the players of it back then. It's a story for grown-ups, by grown-ups and about grown-ups. Morality and consequences of their actions. Today it would not shock as much as it did in 1993, but today it would be released on Steam and would be most likely more popular, played by YouTubers and Twitch streamers alike. Whatever you wanna think about it, it's a game worth completing at least once. Hell, a cyberpunk thriller, is precisely that. There's hell in it, there is dense, dark cyberpunk atmosphere, and it's a thriller. So this time the title actually does say it all. Other than that, it's a point-and-click adventure mixed with RPG, designed by the same team that made Bloodnet, that we spoke of in the previous video. And it shows, especially that the story of Bloodnet is even referenced during playing. The game is set in a dystopian 2095, where the United States is under control of a theocracy called the Hand of God. and since it's been discovered that the hell actually exists and the rulers control all the gates to it, all the criminals and insurgents are sent one way there rather to prisons and jails. You control Gideon Ashanti and Rachel Brack, two agents of ARC, Artificial Reality Containment, agency enforcing bans on cybernetic technology and virtual reality. They're both loyal to the agency and blindly follow anything and all that the theocracy decides. They are model workers and citizens. That is until one night the government sends assassins against them trying to kill them in their sleep. After a narrow escape they find themselves in hell, from which they have to find a way out, and then uncover the reason behind the order to kill them. It is clear that their approach to how things are run changes from that point onward. As you progress through the game you'll meet many other characters and some of them are recruitable and can join your party. Each of them have their own inventory of items. And even if you move them between the characters, if you ever decide to let one of the members go, they will take all that's theirs with them, regardless of who's holding those items at the moment. Hell, a cyberpunk thriller, is notable for few things. First of all, it's one of the first games to be released on CD only and to use high-resolution graphics along with digitized speech. Then it features quite a few actors, with Stephanie Seymour and Jeffrey Holder appearing in live footage all throughout, and Grace Jones and Dennis Hopper providing voiceovers. Some of the puzzles, when completed incorrectly, can result in instant death of our two protagonists, so save often and keep multiple saves at all times. And since we're on a subject, couple of the puzzles have errors in them, so I'd like to repeat once again, save often and keep multiple saves at all times. Hell is definitely not a game for kids, not unlike earlier mentioned Dreamweb. But does it live up to Bloodnet's quality of storytelling? It's hard to tell. I'm not even going to attempt drawing a conclusion about it. Despite the title of the next game, one after this one in the video, Morav's World is probably the weirdest game out of all included. In essence, it's a dungeon crawling RPG focusing very heavily on the crawling aspect, to the point that the game has virtually no story to speak of. Sure, in theory it's all about defeating the final boss at dungeon level 200, a Red Dragon King, but in reality the game is entirely open-ended and you can just carry on playing after doing so. The game was created entirely by one person, Steve Morav, a prominent shareware developer in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was one of the very first games ever released to support SVGA high-resolution graphics. The very final version of the game is set to feature multiple continents, each with a randomly generated dungeon of up to 200 levels, and on top of every dungeon sits the town, which itself is a maze too. It is filled with banks, shops, inns and temples, and you will visit all of these often while playing. Morav's World features well over 40 kinds of enemies, each with their own strengths and weaknesses and set of abilities, and over 100 spells that you'll have access to. The character creator is rather robust as well. You get to pick from 8 races: human, elf, dwarf, hobbit, gnome, ogre, sprite and imp, each described by set of attributes of strength, constitution, intuition, dexterity, wisdom and luck. There can be one of 7 available classes of fighter, worshipper, that's a new one, monk, wizard, priest, sage and a mage. And finally, all also have your visual attributes of sex, age, height and weight, though these have really no influence on the game. You control a single character, so while there's a lot to mix and match here, you'll only get to experience one of those choices at each playthrough. Out of all classes, Monk has a very interesting gameplay mechanic. He cannot carry any inventory with him whatsoever, but he has every single spell in the game memorized from the get-go as you start the game, and you don't have to find them one by one as you play. The game features an auto-map and presents the game world in 4 separate screens, showing you all 4 cardinal directions at once in these 4 mentioned 4 screens. Now that's a tongue twister for a foreigner such as myself. In the end, Morav's World, because it has no real plot whatsoever, is a pure dungeon crawler where your only real aim is to level up as much as you can and become as powerful as possible. If that is something down your alley and you don't mind rather slow-paced refresh of screen after movement, even on modern systems I must add, then check it out. If all of that sounded random and weird to you however, skip it. There's better games, like Mordor on early Windows for instance, which coincidentally has nothing to do with Tolkien's Mordor, but that's a subject for another video. Chamber of the Psy Mutant Priestess, aka Cult the Temple of the Flying Saucers, however you wanna look at it, is 2 extremely weird titles for a game. Any game really. It is first-person adventure game set in post-apocalyptic future where 2 main races remained as ruling powers: tuners, who possess mental psi powers, and protozorgs, who are physically mutated. You play as Raven, a young tuner working for a tuner network. On one of the routine missions, you and your partner Sci-Fi, I know, the character names are as stupid as the title of the game is, so you and your partner notice a massacre of a village full of innocents by the Protozorks. And against Tuners Network's orders, you decide to fight back against the Protozorks to save their inhabitants. As you fight, however, your partner is captured by the villains, and to have any chance of saving her, you let yourself be captured too. So your mission is to find Sci-Fi that's in captivity and get both of you out of the Protozorks prison temple. Along the way you'll solve many puzzles, some of which can be completed via use of items you'll gain as you play, and others may require use one of your 8 Psi powers. They are quite useful and can range from as simple as night vision all the way to being able to read someone's mind, but they are not infinite. You have a reserve energy that is shared between all of them. Keep that in mind. While the game itself is not timed, many of the tasks that you'll be attempting along the way are. Even at the very beginning, we have an in-game hour to recover 5 mysterious skulls. Fortunately, perhaps not with this challenge, but some other can be skipped if played correctly, and many of the puzzles and situations may have more than one solution. It is worth pointing out, however, that Chamber of the Mutant Priestess is a game that's a victim to an early adventurous design tropes, so there's numerous multiple ways that you can either die in the game, or accidentally drop or miss an object required for its completion, leaving you either dead or in a point of no return. So save smart and save often. I feel like I'm repeating it like a mantra today. Anyway, Chamber of the Mutant Priestess, while being one of the more unusual and atmospheric games in the genre, is definitely not a title for everyone, and only most patient and methodic players will be able to fully enjoy it. I feel like today's video is mainly about weird, unusual but mostly fun to play games. Valhalla, aka Ragnarok, is no different. It's a fantasy roguelike set in the Norse world and mythology, and it's more than evident all throughout as story, quests, events, characters and even items all come from it and are rather well known. So characters like Thor, Loki and Hela, and items like Mjolnir and Gungir. If you're into the Norse thing, all that makes sense. If not, then the team will not detract from playing. On the contrary, you may actually learn something new playing the game. Unlike most roguelikes of the time, Valhalla does not use ASCII characters presentation and actually has a full graphical interface and in-game graphics. They may be very simple, but are a definite step up over the norm nonetheless. It's 999 AD, and the Ragnarok is imminent. You play as young Viking who decides to answer the unspoken call and sets out in hopes of thwarting of the prophecy. Unlike in other roguelikes, there are actually quests that you can take as you play the game. There's not many of them, in fact there's so few I'll list them in a second. But they're notable and important both lore-wise and within the game itself. So you can free Baldur's Soul, locate and return Mjolnir to Thor, locate and return Gjall to Heimdall, locate and return Miming to Freyr, locate and return Gandir to Odin, and finally find a manor for Tyr so he could fight while having one arm. There's 6 classes to choose from, and they are the Blacksmith, the Alchemist, the Sage, the Conjurer, the Woodsman and the Viking. Each of them has a primary skill and power, and every 10 levels you may choose to change the class to keep on adding skills and abilities to eventually create the ultimate Norse warrior. Because that's what the game is mainly about, defeating monsters and most importantly character development. And since we're on a subject, you can use Polymorph to change forms into virtually any creature present in the game short of gods and demigods. You can also modify your body in most unusual ways, not only changing your gender, but also number of fingers and eyes, to name a few. It's a bit unexpected mechanic, but fun to discover and play with. Interestingly enough, Valhalla was released as freeware, meaning its advertising was limited to word of mouth and random rare small reviews in gaming mags. But at least it was available entirely free. Fans of roguelikes will find a lot to love in Valhalla, and those that never played the games in the genre can't really ask for a better title to start with. After all, it's not only free, but also approachable as it features graphics. So it's a recommendation. Also, I never expected myself to be in a position to say that you should play the game because it has graphics. Liero is an odd one on this list. Not because it's weird, but because it doesn't fit on it the same way others do. Why, you may wonder? Well, in most of Central, Eastern and Northern Europe it was actually pretty well known. It wasn't as popular anywhere else, but these 3 regions at the very least knew well of it. Fact that it released in 1999, so when the DOS was already on its way out and most devs were betting on Windows and DirectX set of libraries, may have been a contributing factor to game's obscurity, outside where it was developed, that is. Liero is a Finnish gem of a game and described easiest as worms in real time. It's basically a versus game between two players where each controls one few pixels in size worm in a deathmatch-like scenario. Before each match, both sides pick 5 weapons out of available 40, and then the game starts in a very worms-themed correct setting, so in the ground. Worms can dig tunnels and swing on ninja ropes like Spider-Man for traversal, and I have to say that this real-time choice for gameplay, not limited by the timer, is really fun. Both health and preset weapon pickups may appear in the game field, and players can collect them to change the tide of the combat in the last moment. All weapons have unlimited ammo, but also all need to be reloaded. Generally speaking, the more powerful the weapon is, the sooner you'll have to reload it. So the deadliest ones usually need to be reloaded after each shot. Naturally then, it's advisable to pick a wide spread of weapons from weakest to strongest to always have something ready for any situation that may occur. And while it may not be instantly obvious what could happen that would warrant not only settling for other than the strongest weapons only, you have to remember that the game is in real time and both players do whatever they can, with all means at their disposal, to outdo the other and put them to the ground. So sometimes a fraction of a second faster weapon reload may be a deciding factor in whether you win or lose. The Era offers 3 game modes: Game of Tag, Capture the Flag, and everyone's favorite Deathmatch. They're all fun and can be enjoyed in split-screen multiplayer, which is definitely preferred way of playing the game, or against CPU. It's still fun, but it's also clear that the AI is lacking creativity and shrewdness in its strategy as compared to a person. If you're looking for a straight-up fun game, one that you'll have great time playing against a friend or friends in improvised drink-induced leagues, there is no better in this video. Moonbase is interesting. For all intents and purposes, it's your simplified SimCity, but on the moon. Your goal is to establish a thriving colony, maximize your profits from shipments to Earth, and most importantly get to the point in which the colony will be self-sufficient. You have a certain budget that you need to distribute between erecting of new structures, production of essentials such as air, water, heat and power, and items for sale on Earth. You start in mineral and elements-rich plot, which is otherwise plain and devoid of anything human and life-sustaining. So, initially, as bare minimum, you'll need to build shelters and life support facilities, with time adding more varied structures serving different purposes. At the time of its release in 1990, Moonbase was probably the most advanced and realistic simulation of its kind. But it's not because of its complexity, and only because it had no real competition. In fact, if you compare it to SimCity, it seems simplistic and very limited in what and how can you do in it. Does it make it a bad game though? Not in the slightest. It's fun for what it is, and if you ever wanted to be a space engineer, lunar architect, interstellar designer, or hold any other yet non-existent job title, there was hardly anything better in 1990. It's not a game for action freaks, joystick cowboys, keyboard jockeys and shooter aficionados, but if you like slower, more methodical games that require having those brain cells of yours work and heat up, you'll love it. They won't overheat, but Moonbase can definitely provide a couple of hours of entertainment with what it offers. Elevators from Hell is a fan-made port of arcade original Elevator Action. The objective of the game is to collect all 7 tokens, 1 on each floor, and then escape the building alive. Each of the floors has 2 sets of elevators, left and right, the elevator panel in the center and token in between the left elevator and the panel. Panel is used to call for an elevator, and it always calls the nearest one, regardless of which side is it. If that was it, however, the game would be simple and fast to complete, and it's anything but. There's a robo-guard patrolling the floors, and he will eliminate you with his laser when he gets nearby. While the game may not be as difficult as the original was, it is challenging nonetheless, as the guard is quite sneaky in fact. But fortunately, if you overlook more than simplistic graphic and sounds, the game is as addictive as arcade one was. Other than the presentation, the main difference between this and Elevator Action is the number of enemies. In Action, they randomly pop out from closed doors, in Hell there's just one, the robo-guard. But he more than makes up for it with his AI. If you enjoy simple arcade titles and graphics are not a game breaker for you, Elevators from Hell is pretty fun. Jason Storm in Space Chase is a side-scrolling action-adventure platformer with an emphasis on the action. If the game looks to you like something you've seen before, then your eyes do not deceive you, cause you have. I mean, Duke Nukem, before 3D was stamped to its name, was a very similar game in its design and gameplay loop. So was Biomenace for that matter. Space Chase is divided into 3 parts, same as most shareware platformers were at the time, with first available for free and the full game unlocked via purchase. Interestingly enough, 3rd episode/part was later re-released as a standalone title too. I don't know how successful that was, but since the game in its entirety is quite obscure, I doubt that the small chunk of it was any more popular. And it's a pity, cause despite simple 16-color EGA presentation, Space Chase is actually pretty good. Story-wise, you play as Jason and are sent on a mission of finding and destroying Evil Guys Incorporated. It's a rogue and evil organization bent on taking control of planetary government, and if that fails, destruction of all human life on Earth. Or both. Details elude me, but they're bad and that's what counts. The game will take you through their stronghold all the way to the final showdown in the fortress above Earth in the orbit. Space Chase is your typical PC sharer platformer of the time, and this had a very different design approaches compared to other platformers on systems like Amiga, and even more so when looking at the console games of the time. I mean, you could show me any 3 platformers released in the first half of 1990 on PC and 2 other platforms, and I could tell you which one came out on PC in a heartbeat. I'm sure you could too, that's how specific the design was. With omnipresent EGA presentation, often simple PC speaker or ad-lib music and sounds, jerky scrolling and odd character movement, either too fast or too jumpy. Space Chase actually supports Sound Blaster and scrolling is quite decent too, but the character movement and jumping especially is just rubbery for the lack of a better word, and weird feeling. Anyway, the levels are huge, having very maze-like design to them and requiring you to solve simple puzzles like finding right combinations of switches or keys for correct doors. It's a good example of a genre I like to call early 90s PC platformers and a decent but not great playing game, worth completing once. Hyperspeed is a follow-up to an earlier Lightspeed and probably the best game in this entire video, at least to me. It's a space combat role-playing set in, surprise surprise, space. Although it came before Frontier, it has a lot to do with it and earlier Elite too. And you're gonna like it, cause what you have to do in Hyperspeed is what you in particular do best. So save mankind. Yes, again. Your objective, if you choose to accept it, is to locate a suitable home for mankind after Earth that's nearly totally uninhabitable. So, you're sent off in your trusty ship to do just that. Oh, and if by any chance you don't choose to accept the mission, you'll still have to do it. Unwillingly perhaps, but you do. It's not mission impossible after all, but future of what's left of our race. The game features 4 large star clusters, each with its own difficulty level measured by kinds of aliens you meet there, their attitude towards you, combat encounters, and most importantly the overarching task/setting. While one cluster may have a despotic alien force ruling it with an iron fist and other races trying to survive under their oppression, the other may feature a sneaky plan that when implemented may save the universe, or destroy it, and you'll play instrumental part in either. Hyperspeed is really big. It features many different alien races, each with their own agendas, and each requiring different diplomatic approach, and they respond uniquely to your behavior. One may not like if you shoot back when fired upon, while others may respect your wins against their own aggressors as a sign of strength. Sometimes you'll enter direct relations with outwardly species, and sometimes you'll send probes to initiate contact from a safe distance without putting yourself at risk of direct encounter. Your ship components can be upgraded or replaced, so you'll be also maintaining that, trying to keep the vessel at peak effectiveness. Hyperspeed wouldn't be a good game, however, if it didn't feature trading, same as all great futuristic space operas do. So you'll also get to do that. You don't have to, but can. To summarize, you're to find a suitable Earth 2.0 candidate and then negotiate its use with the race that the planet belongs to. Graphics and sound design is really good too, and definitely above the industry average for 1991. Overall, if you enjoy expansive space RPGs playing similarly to Wing Commander or Elite, with a bit bigger and more serious plot and more proverbial meat on the bones, you'll love Hyperspeed. Amazon Guardians of Eden is a point-and-click adventure and one of the first titles to use SVGA graphics and digitized sounds. The game is a definition of a B-movie adventure and is designed to feel like. I mean, all the dialogues, cutscenes it's filled with, and even cliffhangers at the end of each chapter just scream B. And when you're in a mood for B, there's no A that you'd rather watch. Or play in this case. Cause if you're in the right mindset and want to get lost in an overacted, underperformed crazy scenario, to forget about your daily reality and troubles, there's just nothing better. It is set in 1957 and tells the story of Jason Roberts, who you play as, I must add, and whose brother was attacked during an expedition into the Amazon. And now Jason sets out on his own expedition to help his brother and find a long-lost treasure. The controls are pretty weird, as they feel like a stepping stone between the older control schemes and modern point-and-click ones. So, you move Jason with a keyboard but use mouse to interact with the environment and for puzzling. Grand majority of these puzzles is inventory-based, although in some cases a correct dialogue choices may be necessary too. There are some small action sequences here and there as well, like riding a canoe for instance. Unfortunately, most of the puzzles require quick thinking, as if you don't act fast enough, Jason may get killed. This choice is also a leftover from an older epoch of adventure game design. Not something I enjoy in particular, but it is what it is. Oh, and you'll be hunting for pixel-sized objects too, so it's that kind of a game. Keep that in mind. The presentation, however, is of very high quality for the time, with all the characters digitized on beautifully drawn backgrounds, adding to the immersion and atmosphere of the over-the-top story. I forgot to mention before, but in some points you get to temporarily switch to a female lead too, so you can't complain about variety of gameplay really. Despite being able to find yourself in an irreversibly stuck position and death on seemingly every corner just a mouse click away, Amazon Guardians of Eden is actually really fun. And if you let yourself get drawn into its plot, you'll have a hell of a time. Robinson's Requiem takes place in a far future when humanity achieved faster-than-light travel, but still haven't explored the galaxy in its entirety. To chart new and unknown areas, explorers called Robinsons are sent out on scouting missions. Most of the time they're criminals and in general individuals deemed dangerous to society or otherwise unwanted. Even more so, their ships are usually sabotaged so that they could never come back. Grim, I know, but the future is not going to be sunshine and rainbows. We can see that already, we don't need video games for that. Anyway, you're one of those Robinsons, stranded on a remote alien planet and in contact with a mysterious telepathically gifted woman. As it turns out, she knows the best way off the planet, so you'll have to work together to escape. Robinson's Requiem mixes pre-rendered sprite character models with voxel terrain for environment, and is played from the first-person perspective, which may look awful today, but was actually head-turning back in the day. At any given point, the game keeps track of over 100 variables, from your character's temperature through any potential illnesses like flu or malaria, to various more and less dangerous injuries, which untreated may become infected and even lead to an amputation or death. Scary stuff, but I suppose that's how life on the frontier looks like, especially Space Frontier. All the tools and items you'll need to achieve your final goal you'll have to make yourself from ground up, and overall the game is a mixture of survival simulation with crafting. Robinson's Requiem is one of the most unusual and unique games not only of the time but to this day. So if you enjoy novel titles, it's definitely one not to sleep on. There's not that much I can say about The Last IHOF. It is not only a freeware but also open source and one of the weirdest vertically scrolling shooters out there. In fact, it looks like something designed for early 8-bit machines given how much it gives into its design's craziness. So bear with me as I try to explain this oddity. You're a beer bottle. Yup, you may have thought that you were a person, but you were wrong. You're a beer bottle. IHOF beer bottle to be precise, which I presume is a well-known brand in Switzerland. You tell me. I mean, if you're Swiss and happen to watch my videos, you should know. Anyway, you're a beer bottle, that's already established way too many times, and you fly in space fighting other competitive beer brands and alcohol kinds, shooting bottle caps at them. The more you destroy, the higher the score, which is actually not awarded in points but in liters of alcohol and money. Money that you can spend between the levels to purchase additional smaller side bottles that accompany your main one in your fight against other booze. Up to 6 of these can fly with you following at all times, and each next one is a huge help in your struggle. There's 5 levels in the game and most enemies are alcohol related in one way or another. So even if they're not alcohol bottles or brands per se, they may be items related to hangovers, so alarm clocks, coffee pots, aspirin, etc. Fear not, but they're far in between. In some levels you'll encounter mini-bosses, which are usually whole crates of rival beers and beer companies' logos, and these obviously feel more spongy and can take much heavier beating before giving in. The Last IHOF is not a great game, but it's not inherently bad. It's just really unusual and everything about it screams promotion, which funny enough is actually not the case, as it was developed by an independent group called Alpha Helix as a commentary against concentration of Swiss beer market, which led to decline of smaller independent breweries, not unlike the titular IHOF. Not often we get to talk about games that actually had something to say, had a message for the consumers, rather than just being games for the sake of it. So here you go, here's one. And good that it was made for a reason, because as a game, it's average at best. Dragon Isles is a top-down fantasy-themed RTS. The archipelago of Dragon Isles has been a home to a peaceful, loving nation for eons, until one day a hostile fleet arrived, nearly wiping them all off. Remnants scattered around the world, and any that survived went into hiding to remain silent for decades. Years later, a leader rose, gathered the best and strongest of what the nation still had, and set sail toward the archipelago to reclaim it. This is where you step in, as you'll once more have to save those that have been wronged in your ultimate quest for good. Don't know how you get to be such an amazing person, but somehow you are, and I respect that. Or as I wrote in my script draft, "Respectat." Makes no sense, but that's what I found in it. Must be my cat's making. Anyway, you start with a few simple warriors and settlers and have to build a thriving town, expand it to draft and support a huge army, and finally retake your motherland. That sounds stupid, let's try again. Blah blah blah, town, blah blah blah, army, and retake your Dragonland. Now that's better. Editor, scratch the first, keep the second one in. Oh wait, I don't have an editor. As in most RTSs, you'll be gathering resources, creating units, building and maintaining structures, repelling enemy attacks and launching raids yourself. When all enemy units are taken care of and their buildings destroyed, the island is recaptured and you can move to the next one, usually a more demanding one. There are many different kinds of units available, each with their own usage scenarios, and they're for the most part a low fantasy fare of knights, archers, cavalry, war elephants and monks to name a few. But there are some more exotic ones as well, like spies and ninjas, so there's that. There's no fog of war whatsoever, so you can sorta keep tabs on what the CPU is doing and try to prepare for it and for your response accordingly. Dragon Isles is not the best RTS out there. I mean, if it was, you would have heard of it by now, but it's a decent one, so if you're into this, give it a try. Zeliard is a side-view role-playing platformer. Yes, you heard that right. And it's a game that originally came out on NECPC 8801 before being ported to DOS. The ancient demon Yashakin, aka Emperor of Chaos, emerges from a 2000 years long slumber to unleash his wrath on the prospering and peaceful kingdom of Zeliard, seemingly in revenge for what happened ages ago, but that's irrelevant. He starts by summoning a 115 days long sun rain that turns the kingdom into a near-dead desert, and finishes off with turning King's only daughter, beautiful Princess Felicia, into a stone statue. You play as Knight Duke Garland, sent by the spirits to save the kingdom and princess. To do so, however, you must first recover 9 magical jewels, the so-called Tears of Esmesanti, and while going about it you must also slay the demon Jashin. The game world is divided into towns and dungeons. In towns you can rest in inns, visit banks, sages and shops where you purchase weapons and equipment, and if you can, you should remember about doing that anytime you'll get a chance, as this gear is your only help and the only thing you can rely on your adventure. Other than your unquestionable skill, that is. For the most part, with the exception of special buildings, there's no combat in towns whatsoever, so they're your de facto safe zones. Dungeons or labyrinths, depends how you wanna look at them, are a different case altogether. They're all uniquely designed and playing, and you'll fight hundreds of various enemies in them, regular and bosses alike. And this is also where you earn alamas from monsters. Alamas, as oddly named as they are, can be exchanged in towns for money or with NPCs for special quest items. Bosses drop the tiers upon defeat, and while the dungeons are quite big, the gameplay overall is rather linear and feeling more like a Castlevania title than the full-fledged RPG. While Zeliard remained unknown on PC even when it was relatively new, it's easily one of the more fun games in the side-scrolling platformer RPG mashup genre and worth completing even today. Metal and Lace: The Battle of the Robo-Babes is not only the longest titled game in this video, but a sci-fi themed versus fighting game, and the only one that had a mature rating out of all I've spoke about today. Metal and Lace is set in the grim future of 2052 and features a cast of 7 female mecha robots that participate in a robot fighting tournament at Mecha Island. What mecha is, I do not know, but that's the term apparently. The game can be played in a single-player mode where you have to defeat series of opponents in one-on-one fights, or in versus mode against a friend, or associate or enemy. The game really doesn't check for that. Before starting off each fight, a player must pay an entry fee, and whoever comes on top in the 2 out of 3 rounds wins the fight. Interestingly enough, the health bar doesn't replenish between them, so you'll have to use money earned to buy energy batteries in the shop to refill it. There are offensive and defensive upgrades that can be purchased, and if you can only afford those, you should always invest, as these along with entry fees are the only things you can realistically spend the money on. So there's no reason to hoard it. Well, unless you're running some kind of a weird challenge playthrough, but I honestly don't see that happening. You can also purchase different armors. They all vary in stats, strong and weak points, and repetitive use of one makes it stronger with each next fight. So pick one that you like and stick with it. Metal and Lace features a pretty nice high-resolution, high-color presentation and enjoyable fighting mechanics with unique special moves for each character. It's perhaps not on the Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat level, but it's fun the way it is. Interestingly enough, there are 2 versions of the game available, each released separately, a standard one and a mature one featuring partial nudity that was only available by mail order. Fans of versus fighters will definitely enjoy it, others will have to give it a go and make up their own minds about it. While talking about Metal and Lace, I've said interestingly enough twice. Well, 3 times now, and it's a sin against English language, so punish me the way you see fit. Or better don't, cause you know, I'm a silly foreigner and I know no better, right? Cannonade, as the title may give it away, is about shooting your cannon. But not in a nefarious way with destruction in mind or at someone. It's not a game of that sort. In fact, it's a real-time puzzler where you shoot your cannon at the ball that's moving about the level to change its direction so that it would get to the exit. You can move the cannon around all 4 gameboard sides to manipulate aforementioned ball and other level elements. Some stages are timed, others aren't, but all are pretty fun if you don't mind your brain muscle to exercise a little. Where brain muscle actually is in your head? Don't worry about it and definitely don't look it up, it's there, trust me. It's between that bigger bit and that small one in the back, just tucked under it, sticking out a little on the left. So don't worry about it, I wouldn't lie to you now, would I? Each level is littered with numerous different objects, some of which have to be destroyed, while others rearranged for the ball to have clear path to the exit. There are some special tiles in Cannonade too, adding to the playability, and they can hold the ball, make it change its direction, teleport it to another point on the gameboard, or downright destroy it. Sounds and graphics are not great, and I'm putting it nicely. For 1993 I really would have expected more. Still, they serve their purpose, which is being the background to the puzzling mechanic, which in itself is, well, troublesome. At least to explain. I really want to like Cannonade, I do. The idea is something I can get behind, but the way the game works is a bit disappointing, to me at least. There's a slight noticeable but hard to gauge delay between when you press shoot and when the shot actually leaves the cannon. The timer in those timed levels is rather unforgiving, so the game ends up being pretty fun in those without it and something you dread attempting in those that do have it. So approach it at your own discretion. Machiavelli the Prince is a sorta unofficial upgraded re-release of a year prior's Merchant Prince. Sorta because there was some kind of a feud between the 2 companies responsible for it, developer Holistic Design and publisher Quantum Quality Productions. And in the end that falling out spawned Machiavelli the Prince that you're watching now. And since we've mentioned the publisher, I gotta say that Quantum Quality Productions is a brave name. With a name like that I expect quality and nothing else. I mean, they're not great, good or even premium quality productions. They're Quantum. And that raises my expectations astronomically. Fortunately, Machiavelli the Prince is better than Merchant Prince and it's named appropriately too. Why? Well, in theory, it's a historical trading simulation where you're in control of one of the most influential families in the 14th century Venice. Machiavelli the Prince can be played alone against CPU, which I do not recommend unless you've no other choice, or with others. And in that last mode is where it shines, because you not only get to telegraph your superiority over the others you play with by making better and more profitable trade routes and business decisions, but you can also decide to play low and dirty by publicly slandering them, assassinating their representatives, attacking their units, or even burning down their buildings. So, doing the titular Machiavellian shenanigans. Sounds fun? Good, cause you can also bribe senators, purchase for the lack of a better word, cardinals to support you spreading word about you controlling a holy and blessed resource, regardless if anything like that even exists, because it doesn't. But whatever you wanna think about Machiavelli the Prince, it's not an easy game to classify. On one hand, it's your straight up trading / empire building fair, but on another it's a diplomacy-filled political simulation or even an exploration strategy. It's a title unlike many, short of its earlier iteration of Merchant Prince, and it's one that's really worth checking out, if you're into strategy and management games that is. Fury of the Fairies is an absolute gem that should have spawned a whole series of follow-ups. It's one of the most, if not the most, ambitiously designed and well thought out platformer I've ever seen. You're controlling 4 differently colored fairy characters, each with a unique skill set. The red one can chew basically through anything, biting all the walls, floors and anything else in his way. The yellow can shoot basic and charged shot, both quite useful in offense against hordes of cute but deadly enemies and more importantly in certain puzzles. Blue Fairy can swim, dive and shoot bubbles. And finally Green Fairy, he has a grapple and a line. And ladies and gentlemen, he works these two like a charm, crossing over large stretches of spiky obstacles, going where no other fairy went or could go before, and pulling things that could, at least in this game, only be pulled via line. All in all, you've got to utilize all these skills to complete increasingly more difficult levels in variously themed worlds. Each and every stage is a little puzzle, in latter zones spanning huge areas, requiring sharp thinking and often godlike dexterity all at the same time. But having worked out when and how to use every one of those little colorful rascals is really rewarding. And a cherry on top of this already sweet cake of a game are bonus areas hidden in every single level. At times even nested within each other, like some kind of crazy coins-filled ration nesting dolls. Best of all, difficulty growth in Fury of the Furies is very gradual, allowing you to learn all the tropes before being dropped in deep water. That said, make no mistake misjudging the title for what it is. As I mentioned earlier, it's a very much a game of skills as much as a game of wits. Easy to get into and devilishly hard to master. You can learn more about it in a complete review video of it that I have on my channel. It may be for Amiga's version, but the game is identical on both systems, so everything said there will apply to PC Sport too. For all intents and purposes, Legend of Myra is your boulder dash with few new features, a story, and released a little too late. Cause while it's a pretty decent and fun game in itself, I can't escape the feeling that it should have dropped 2-3 years earlier. Story-wise, for whatever the reason, in the future humanity decided to get rid of all the rabbits. Perhaps the cute factor was too much to bear and they just had to go. Or maybe they multiplied to the point they've started being dangerous to the environment. Who knows? The point is someone out there decided they had to go. And for another unclear to me reason, it was decided that the best way to do it is to store all of the world's cabbage underground. I mean, if you think about rabbits, do you think of carrots or cabbages? Anyway, you play as Myra, one of the last few rebellious bunnies that is not going to stand by and watch his kind be cut from a sweet cabbage supply. He's gonna do something about it, and by extension of that, if you decide to play the game, you will do something about it too. So, you have to puzzle your way through 120 levels collecting cabbages, and if you get them all, you'll complete the game. For the most part, standard mechanics of Boulder Dash apply to Legend of Myra. There's dirt that you dig through, there are rocks that are susceptible to gravity, and there are enemies out to get you. You can kill those with either rock that you drop on them or one of the few available weapons. Because yeah, in Legend of Myra you get to run and gun too. You can carry a gun, flamethrower, rocket launcher or even bombs. And you're a bunny. I know, we should prepare in real life, cause you never know. Was the weapon addition necessary? Definitely not to keep the original Boulder Dash formula fun, but perhaps devs wanted to get their game to stick out. And they succeeded, it does, like a sore thumb. And while the variety is fun, the ideas in Legend of Myra are just a bit over the top, and after a little while become feeling too ridiculous and tiring. It's not a bad game, don't get me wrong, but it's not particularly good one either. Before there was Harry Potter, we had Magic Boy, a boy that lived. Nope. A boy that wanted to be a wizard, and his name was Hewlett Packard. Now hold on a sec, let me check my notes. I see. It came to my attention that it was actually Hewlett, not Packard. So Hewlett goes about making his dream come true in a 2D vertically scrolling platformer. Story-wise, you're an apprentice for a wizard, you're talented, no doubt about that, but also very young and clumsy. So one night after working late, you tipped over a hidden trapdoor and released your Master Wizard's collection of crazy animals and monsters. Now you gotta recapture them as if nothing ever happened so that you could continue your studies and not be banished by the Master Wizard. So you have to stun the monsters with your magic wand, then pick them up and then send them back to the basement they came from. The game takes place over 4 worlds: Sandland, Wet World, Plastic Place and Future World. Each of these is divided into 8 levels for a total of 32, and there are also additional 32 bonus levels, for a whopping total of 64 stages. There are plenty numerous environmental obstacles in the game and different pickups. Some can upgrade your shot to hit through walls or shoot up and down, others multiply it or even reward letters that when collected to spell extra do just that, make you extra. Extra cool, extra fun, and most importantly, extra tough. Oh no, it seems I've mixed the scripts again. I really have to save up for an assistant cause clearly doing it all on my own doesn't work. I'm too scatterbrained. So yeah, collecting all letters, awards and extra life obviously. Graphics and sound-wise, Magic Boy is really good provided you run it on a system with VGA and Sound Blaster, it feels like a console game then. But if you try to launch it on anything below the specs, it will sound and look like an afterthought to the full experience. As if the assets were quickly converted to lower fidelity without putting too much attention to it. Is that the case? I don't know, but that's how it looks like. Pangea Return to Planet Earth is first episode in a planned 2 of an interactive science fiction story set in 21st century, years after humanity developed faster than light travel and explored many neighboring galaxies meeting 4 distinct alien species. And it's told in a comic strip format. As far as it's known, second episode never released, perhaps because of the first one's reception, which mind you was not a bad game, just not popular enough to guarantee a follow-up. So whenever you don't know what's the reason behind something, in this case lack of a follow-up, it had to be money. Or lack thereof, because of low sales. I obviously have no proof of that whatsoever, but that's what I presume. The story is set in a dystopian future where a mega-corporation called Pangea absorbed all countries under its wing and basically governs all of the world the way it sees appropriate. So all the population is divided into 3 groups. The privileged and productive, who are worthy of protection and servitude in the eyes of the corporation, the expendables living in the old, long-abandoned cities that double down as penal colonies these days, and finally the rebels called the moles, living underground now that the Earth's surface is hardly suitable to sustaining life of any kind. Clearly the latter 2 groups are of no use to the corporation, so they're deemed unwanted and treated as such. You play as Duck, not one that says quack quack, but one spelled D-A-K. And since your father was once a leader of the rebels, you're asked to return to Earth to help with negotiations between them and the Expendables. A treaty between the two sideline factions could prove an issue to the Order led by the Corporation, however, so it's important that it goes smooth. Pangaea Return to Planet Earth is just that. It's a story of you and your outwardly companion coming back to Earth and your preparations to meet with the leader of the Expendables in prison city called Purgatory. Pangaea is very story heavy, so if you're someone who doesn't enjoy reading through walls of text and putting facts and information together, it's definitely not for you. If you do, however, then branching plot and many decisions that you'll make along the way may be something you'd actually enjoy. Personally, I'm not entirely sure that the game's worth playing anymore, now that we know that there's no conclusion to the storyline, but on the other hand we had Matrix, that ended up on the cliffhanger and released no sequels whatsoever after 1999, so... Prince of Evil is an outstanding top-down arcade game not unlike the famous Amiga's Chaos engine, but played in single player only and in a different setting. You're a legendary Chinese warrior. I mean, I'm not sure you are, you might be, but would you even tell me? Coming out as one would be of no benefit to you really. So maybe you are, maybe you're not, but in this game you play as one. And you're hacking and slashing away through dozens of different enemies and creatures based in Chinese mythology, all the way to the final Prince of Evil. The game offers many unique weapons, each specifically useful against a certain type of an enemy, and it's worth learning what works best where, as while they can be carried and not used when not necessary, they have a very limited number of charges, after using of which they are gone. So even if memorization of this is not required per se, it helps a lot to make the gameplay easier. Other than the melee weapons, you also encounter various other pickups like ammo for projectile weapons, ginseng for health, treasures and quest items. From time to time you'll stand face to face with much stronger boss foe than all the trash mobs you mow through, and this can truly be challenging and are usually very interestingly designed. Dragon is one that especially comes to mind. I think it's obvious by now, as you're watching the footage, that both sounds and graphics are excellent, and the gameplay loop is really enjoyable. But if that hasn't came across like it, let me assure you that Prince of Evil is great and deserved much more recognition than it ever had. And its obscurity is a riddle to me, cause a quality game like that usually tends to spawn large fan followings. Perhaps the reason was that the developer was Taiwanese and did not care to promote the game abroad as much. Perhaps, as we will never know. What's important though is that it's probably the second best game in this video after Fury of the Fairies, and you should check it out if you get a chance. Baryon is a definition of a hidden gem. Why it ended up being virtually unknown and forgotten by the gaming world is something I do not understand in the slightest. And it's also vertically scrolling shoot 'em up. It features two different ships to choose from, each with its own unique set of upgradable weapons, missiles both regular and homing, with the earlier being stronger and latter more convenient, and a bomb and a shield, which hopefully are more than self-explanatory. There's also many different enemies, and they seem to be going at you all the time from all sides relentlessly as if their own life meant nothing to them. And if you play your cards right, excuse me, I meant if you aim your shots right and use bombs wisely, that's precisely what their lives will be. That said, don't underestimate Baryon, as it's definitely not one of the easier shooters out there. On the contrary, it will test both your reactions and how well you adapt to ever-changing on-screen action. Come to think of it, this may have been one of the factors of its obscurity. Shower version consists of only one level, which is not much to familiarize yourself with the title and decide if it's something you'd like to invest money in. And the full version has only 6 of these, so I suppose you don't get much for your money either. Well, maybe not in terms of length, cause when it comes to quality it's nearly as good as Tyrion. Baryon looks really good, with differently designed enemies and stages, tons of explosions on screen at once, and overall clean but detailed approach to presentation. Sounds are pretty decent too, some of them very heavy, perhaps a bit too much, but it all adds up to the fun factor in the end. Mixture of great graphics and decent sounds with fun and engaging combat. If you manage to find Baryon somewhere for a decent price and are into shoot 'em ups, it's a no-brainer. Go and get it. If you don't care for these though, it's gonna be just one of many other similar shooters to you. Shooting Gallery is precisely that, shooting gallery. There's no plot, no story, no progression of any kind, and no target to aim for. Other than the obvious ones moving on the screen, that is. In fact, it looks like a simple early 8-bit game lifted to the 16-bit presentation and sold without any gameplay improvements whatsoever. If from the get-go it sounds like something you won't be into, you're more than likely right. It's not a game that tries to be anything special, at least I haven't noticed anything of sort. It does not, however, exist for no reason. I actually see a very strong usage scenario for it, at least for someone like myself. Let me explain. I have thousands of games, literally, and probably even more retro games, and while most of these are emulated today by either platform-specific software or DOSBox for PC stuff, I have a lot available at hand at any given time. More than one person ever should or would ever need. So more often than not, when I find myself with a little free time and I want to play something older, I find it difficult to decide what. And I tend to spend a lot of time pondering what I'm in a mood for. And this is where the shooting gallery comes in play. It's an excellent palette cleaner, for the lack of a better word. It's a great game to quickly fire up between other games from a shortcut in your retro launcher of choice, just to demolish some moving targets aimlessly with your mouse, waiting for an inspiration, for an idea what to play, scoring meaningless points. And if used as that, it's more than worth its size on your hard drive, which even compared to today's pictures you take with your phone is laughably small. There are 7 levels in the game, 6 are sort of natural progression of each other, being very simple but also similar to one another, and last 7th is not your typical shooting gallery, but more of a shoot the cowboys and spare the innocent fare of sorts. Still extremely simple and not engaging your brain in the slightest, but a tiny bit more interesting than the earlier ones. So, Shooting Gallery is not a great game, but in the same time it's one of the best single-purpose titles, realized perfectly to serve that one particular basic purpose. Knights of Xantar is a Japanese role-playing game, a third part in Dragon Knight series that were never released in the West, and it's very heavily leaning on anime-style eroticism, which obviously you won't see in this video as it would have get both blocked and demonetized, not necessarily in that order. The game starts with you being robbed, out of your precious legendary armor, magical sword and even your clothes. So you have to get some money fast to get yourself back on your feet. Luckily the mayor has a quest for you that will see you traveling the world, fighting and defeating various often odd enemies, meeting beautiful women and along the way learning about your true self. You'll meet characters that will join your quest along the way and will help you succeed. How come I'm so sure that you will? Because I've seen you do it hundreds of times already and you hardly ever failed. At least not when I was watching. Anyway, you and your troop of hentai warriors travel the world on an overworld map while the combat is played in a very similar setting as in early Final Fantasy games. Enemies and your party members attack automatically in real time, but you can pause it at any moment to give commands, use items and cast spells or change a preset AI behavior. There are 8 attack strength levels, with stronger ones requiring more time to pull off, so there's a strategic layer to battles where you need to gauge when to risk slower but more powerful and possibly game-changing attack and when to stick to faster but weaker jabs. Knights of Xantar is full of sexual imagery and nudity, but it's very soft for today's standards, even if it was very controversial back then. All that, however, is just an humorous background and neither takes the foreground of gameplay nor influences it in any meaningful way. That said, it should be noted that sexual favors in this game are like currency in others, and more often than not you will be paid with those for services and rescues rendered. Similarly, instead of taverns and inns, you'll replenish your HP and MP by having sex. Knights of Xantar is one of the weirdest JRPGs I've seen. Arguably, I've not seen as many on DOS as on other platforms, but Xantar is odd one way or another. Oh, and along the way you'll get to save Red Riding Hood from being abused by a wolf and Snow White by 7 dwarfs. It's a good game if you like JRPGs and don't mind the boob here and there, sometimes in least expected places. Boob here, boob there, boobs everywhere. SolarWinds The Escape is a space-themed top-down role-playing and a first part of duology, with SolarWinds Galaxy being its direct follow-up. In the future, humans live in planetary system millions of light years from Earth, and while the space travel is common, the hyperdrive allowing to move between the galaxies is forbidden by the rather oppressive solar government. One secretive group, however, spent a decade working on technology, and now that they've developed a working hyperdrive, they want to escape the clutches of totalitarian government. You're playing as Jake Stone, with stone-hard ups, stone-hard cojones and stone-hard morals, and you have to track them down and stop them. As you do, however, you'll realize that the government's evil and conspiring with aliens to treat humans as species for their studies, so you switch sides. The rest you'll have to learn yourself, I'm not gonna spoil it. Gameplay-wise, SolarWinds, while following its plot, is very sandboxy, and it doesn't restrict you from much from the very start of the game. So you're traveling the galaxy, being the badass that you are, and fighting enemy ships, smuggling cargo, upgrading your craft and making money any way you see fit. And there's no one that can stop you. Not for the lack of trying, but there isn't anyone who could. That's how tough you are. Unfortunately, SolarWinds The Escape is a shareware title, meaning that it's very short and can be completed in just a few hours if you skip some of those longer fights. And only after paying for the full version you get access to aforementioned SolarWinds Galaxy, extending the gameplay time and content considerably. Is it a worthy investment to get both? Hard to tell, cause I'm not even sure if it can be purchased anymore, but if you'll find it anywhere for download in its complete form, it's definitely worth a playthrough, especially if you like space opera RPGs. Warhammer Shadow of the Hornet Rat is a single-player fantasy real-time tactics 3D game based on Warhammer Fantasy Tabletop and not unlike modern Total War series of games. You play as mercenary commander Morgan Bernhardt, and the story depicts a conflict with Skaven's intelligent humanoid rats. You're hired by various parties throughout the gameplay to take part in battles against Skavens and help stopping their nefarious plot. And it's those tactical battles that are the main focus of the game, taking into account terrain, constant numbers of units and placement. It's a very enjoyable loop if you get a grasp of it and get used to the controls. Since we're on the subject, you control whole groups and not single units in a very non-linear gameplay, meaning you get to pick alternate missions to progress, so repeated playthroughs are not the same. Those unit groups are divided into typical for the medieval fantasy game, so cavalry, infantry, archers, artillery, magic users, and specialized troops. They transfer from mission to mission with you, provided that they survive, that is. They also gain experience and get better over time. For instance, magic users gain access to new, more powerful spells. While the gameplay itself is varied and non-linear, campaign path is, and if you keep succeeding, certain story elements will repeat for all playthroughs. Given how fun and often tactically challenging some battles can be, the fact that some story moments repeat is definitely not a detractor from enjoyment of this really cool game. After each battle you're given a debriefing listing a rundown of number of enemies killed, losses incurred, and experience gained by surviving troops. Losses can be in form of injuries, which only remove affected soldiers temporarily for a duration of one battle, or kills, which are permanent and dead soldiers can only be replaced between battles in town, with numbers of reinforcements fluctuating and not always available to cover all your losses. It goes without saying that replacing more experienced units is much more costly than that of rookies. Warhammer Shadow of the Hornet Rat, despite badly aged simple 3D graphics, is still an amazing game and a great fun to play. And I mean it as someone who usually doesn't care about real-time strategies. Bargon Attack is a sci-fi adventure game based on a French comic book of the same title. It takes place on Earth in a grim near future when an alien race named Bargon conquered and enslaved humanity. You're a 20-something programmer and you decide to get rid of the menace once and for all. Now, how a programmer, so a being known for pale skin, weak upper arm strength and affinity towards numbers, is supposed to do that, I do not know. Personally, I'd rather see a Rambo or Commando type of a dude dealing with the aliens, but if there's no one else, a programmer will have to do, I suppose. And I know it's a new role for you, as you're usually taking part of a aforementioned tough guy, a space fighter pilot or armed to the teeth mercenary, but you can do it. I believe in you. Bargon Attack is an adventure that takes place in around 20 different areas, each of up to 3 screens in size and is rather linear, meaning you can't move to the next area until you complete the previous one. You'll have a lot of fun hunting for stray pixel objects through each of these zones, cause there's quite a few of them, and I'm sure that you'll also enjoy the puzzles, only half of which are totally illogical, and will allow you to have that time of your life cycling through every single object in inventory, trying to use it in dozens of ways unsuccessfully. If that's not enough, you'll cherish every single dev that will surprise you constantly, seemingly coming from nowhere and for no reason. Fun. But if you think I'm dissing the game, then you're, well, right. But honestly only because of the omnipresent devs. Cause other than that, it's basically your Cocktail Visions Goblins games, just a little more tame on the humor, with a bit more serious storyline. Interestingly enough, it's also first Cocktail Visions game that uses FMV cutscenes. If you like adventure games and don't mind saving often and hunting for fleas, it's gonna be a good one. If you get annoyed easily, avoid Bargon Attack at all costs and forget you ever heard of it. Veil of Darkness is an isometric horror-themed role-playing with action-based combat and adventure elements. The game takes place in Romania, in a remote valley that's been cut off from the outside world by the vampire lord Cairn that's keeping a stronghold on it and surrounding areas. You play as cargo pilot, so for once not a hero, whose plane mysteriously crashed in the area and you find yourself trapped within. There you learn that your arrival has been prophesied to bring the evil world Cairn down, so yeah, I was leading you astray, of course you're a hero, because who else would you be? You know, for someone so powerful, you're surprisingly easy to fool. Anyway, the gameplay is largely non-linear, you can move about and freely explore the area, but certain plot-scripted elements and progression is locked to you completing certain actions or finding crucial items. You will obviously have to talk to people, help them out and learn about what's going on in the valley. You'll battle various creatures occasionally, so werewolves, vampires and skeletons are not something that will be a surprise to you, and I'd like to note here that different weapons work better for different enemies, and it's best to figure out what is most effective where earlier rather than later. You'll also solve various puzzles, and these can either be heavily based on figuring out what to do next and where to do it, based on the conversation you'll have with the inhabitants of the area, or are your typical inventory-based ones, where correct items have to be utilized to progress. Fortunately, grand majority of these, regardless of the type, is pretty logical, so if you pay attention to dialogues or apply reasoning when figuring out what to use where, you're more than likely to solve them easily, and it feels really rewarding. All in all, Veil of Darkness is a really good, even if underrated title, and if you're into either adventure games or some light role-playing ones, if you give it a chance, you'll be enchanted by it. Archimedean Dynasty is a truly unique and obscure game that should have gained much more recognition and popularity than it ever did. And yeah, I know I should start with what it is, especially that the video is all about the games that weren't as big as they should have, but I believe that it was worth mentioning what it was robbed of popularity and sales it deserved. I believe Wikipedia entry for it summarizes the situation best with its single sentence that simply says, "The game was commercially unsuccessful in the US," which by mid to late 90s was once again the single biggest gaming market in the world. Anyway, Archimedean Dynasty is an underwater first-person simulation slash shooter that takes place on a post-apocalyptic Earth underwater. So not really on, but more underneath the surface. Tomato tomato. All because of all of the former conflicts, the surface is irradiated and unfit to support life anymore. You're a mercenary and you run series of story and side missions. I'm not gonna share any details about the plot though, as it's shockingly good for a game that's largely a shooter, and it's honestly worth experiencing firsthand. But what I will tell you is that as the game progresses, you'll gain access to new single-person submarines to pilot and variety of upgrades for them as well, always feeling rewarded for your achievements along the way. But the best of all that the AD offers is the physics engine that feels real. I mean, real to me, someone who has no working understanding of advanced aquadynamics, gravity, speed and underwater drag, and how they all correlate with each other, but can still tell you that it feels right, for the lack of a better word. Oh, and before I forget, if you run AD on real hardware and have access to Voodoo graphics accelerators, a patch came out for the game a little after it released that uses this and increases presentation fidelity quite considerably. Could you imagine Sid Meier's game, any of his titles really to be obscure? To not reach the heights of popularity and recognition? To only be a little known and largely forgotten title? Well, there is one. It's also an amazing game, same as all of his titles are, but only ever remembered by a few that played it. Sid Meier's Covert Action is a unique blend of strategy, action and adventure, all rolled into one. And believe it or not, it's amazing. You play a skilled and deadly free agent hired by CIA to investigate an ongoing criminal and terrorist activities. Why do they outsource rather than use their own? Hard to tell, but if I had to guess, I'd say that they must have heard of your countless heroic acts, how you saved the world and universe on numerous occasions, and how, generally speaking, a stand-up person you are. They just have no one better, or even comparable in the slightest skill and experience-wise that is. So, you're either he or she, Maximilian or Maxine Remington respectively, and not many games at the time short of RPGs allowed for a choice of gender, so that's perhaps a small but still welcome addition. Covert Action is divided into missions, they're all time limited and you have to uncover criminal conspiracy details in each before the timer runs out. You do so by completing various spy-themed minigames like combat, cryptography, driving and wiretapping. They're all pretty fun and reward details like locations, names and photos of people involved in crime or connected to a game plot. After each mission you may also receive a promotion, so in a typical for Sid Meier's manner, the game is points based, meaning that at the end of it, same as in Civilization, you're compared in a score table against set named records. Which is kinda pointless if you're playing, cause you're scoring top points every single time, but it may be important to some other gamers, so... Vox Ranger is a horizontally scrolling shooter that's clearly made to be a parody of a genre. Apparently it was designed specifically in response to another shooter, Vox Ranger, by the same developer, so it resulted in no beef between anyone. Especially that the game is actually pretty fun despite its overarching weirdness. You control a pink box flying through beautifully drawn parallax scrolling backgrounds, killing hundreds of various insects and photos of apparently games developers. A thing worth mentioning here is that while there's only 3 levels of parallax, smart background graphics made to look layered make it feel as if it was many more. If you don't pay direct attention to the background, it will definitely appear as if there was more levels of it. While your basic weapon shoots in bursts, it's not the strongest, so thankfully it can be upgraded or rather supplemented by special weapons. They are limited in shots, however, so it's worth to use them sparingly where necessary. Fortunately, there's a separate button for those so they don't replace your main one and not get used too early. That, ladies and gentlemen, is something I'd like to see in all of my shoot 'em ups. Note that down. Anyway, there's also satellite wingmen that fly above and below you, with upgrades and even a shield that does precisely what its name suggests it does. And it's one of the most useful power-ups in all single hit kill shooters. But Box Ranger is not one of these. From my point of view, it's great as I despise single hit kill games, but having a health bar sorta diminishes the value of a shield upgrade. Just saying, it could have been something else. Oh, interestingly enough, you can win upgrades between the stages by playing Rock Paper Scissors minigame too. Box Ranger is not supposed to be a hardcore serious shooter, it's a fun game to pick up and just get lost in for a little while, and as that, it works great. The Four Crystals of Trazer, aka Legend, is an isometric fantasy role-playing. The land of Trazer's eternal enchantment corrupted and transformed all inhabitants into horrible aggressive mutants. You control a band of 4 merry, well, this may be a stretch, we don't know if they really marry, but you do control 4 of them and they are adventurers. And as you arrive in Trazer, it becomes painfully obvious that something wrong has happened, and while it's not immediately apparent if it can be reversed, you decide to try doing just that. So you set out on a quest to cure the land and find and destroy the responsible forces. In Legend, you'll get to create your 4 unique heroes with individual strengths and weaknesses and personalities. You'll learn to use and eventually master an unusual magic system that lets you literally mix and cast dozens of different spells. You'll visit towns big and small, you'll shop around, drink in taverns and have fun in many other locations. Like dungeons that you'll be exploring and beating for hours on end, having the time of your life. Inside this you'll encounter many puzzles too, that you'll be solving, often with the use of magic to raise bridges, open closed passageways and unlock areas among others. On a side note, as I was writing a short script of what I should touch, I miswrote unlock areas to unleak areas. And I just decided I should leave it as that, for comedic reasons. So you get to unleak the areas. What areas is up to you, the game is your oyster. I don't think it fits here, but since I'm clearly dipping more and more into madness, I'm not gonna edit this one out either. Anyway, the 4 characters that you take on the adventure are a Rune Master Wizard, Troubadour Bard, Berserker Barbarian, and an Assassin Thief. And while each feels their own, a Rune Master is definitely the most unique of them all. He gets to mix runes and create many new spells that he'll be casting left and right in and out of combat. Since this preview is starting to grow in size with each said word, and I'm only scratching a surface here really, I'll end it here and just say that if you like role-playing games, Legends is definitely one that you should not ignore. Give it a chance, you'll thank me later. Battlebugs is a RTS based in the world of insects. The title may have giveaway, but you're here watching, I'm here talking, so it had to be mentioned anyway. So yeah, interestingly enough, it was developed by Epix, a development studio appraised more than once when talking about C64 games. They could and they did squeeze everything out of that platform. On DOS, where the hardware limitations were not as dramatic by 1994, when the game released they could focus more on the design and playability, rather than combating system's power or in case of C64, lack thereof. So that's what they did, and we ended up with Battlebugs. Unique, incredibly fun game that no one played or knew about. Sure, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but for the most part, it sadly never got the time in the limelight it should have. The game basically tells a tale, via campaign perspective, of a battle between 2 rival groups of insects in and around the house. So the battlefields will be placed in kitchens, living rooms and backyards, to name a few. Warcraft or Command & Conquer in your bedroom. Can you imagine? You'll get to lead units of various kinds of insects, all differently looking, animated and having their own unique special skills and usage scenarios. It's worth keeping in mind that the game works on heavily expanded rock, paper, scissors mechanics, meaning each unit kind is strong against a specific other and weak against totally different one. So preparing for a mission and then utilizing them correctly is a key to success. While most of 30 available missions can be won by only either annihilating opposing side entirely or capturing all foot pieces on the battlefield, and by capturing I mean holding the position it's in until it turns to your side, for the lack of a better word. The game doesn't really get stale and is as fun all the way through as it initially was. But what's going to be a huge deterrent to some are those latter missions that can get really challenging. So if you're not well versed in tactical RTSs, you may get restless and annoyed repeating some of them more than a couple of times. If you don't mind that or are experienced in a genre, however, Battlebugs is a gem. Give it a go. Stunts is a 3D racing game, and as the title gives away with a single word that it is, it's all about those stunts. You race around the chosen from the built-in set or a created custom track with the aim of completing the lap as fast as possible without crashing. It's not always as easy as it seems, as some of the stages, especially created by users, can be real nightmares to drive on. Or even worse, seemingly simple straights and turns with a neatly hidden jump or a ramp that approached at the wrong speed or angle would topple your vehicle instantly. And since there's hundreds if not thousands of tracks available online, there's hardly an end to the nightmare. I meant fun, obviously, there's hardly an end to endless fun that Stunts provides, right? Right. You can race against the clock or CPU-controlled drivers, there's 11 different in-specs, filling and handling cars to choose from, and a whole plethora of various ramps, loops, jumps and other features to crash around on. Stunts clearly could have aged a bit better than it did, but it's still really fun to speed around in. Even though it's not a simulation, it doesn't feature realistic damage or weather conditions, it's hella entertaining to play against a friend, competing for best times on tracks that you imagined and created yourself. Especially when drinks are involved and you both like racers at least a bit. And with the track editor that's surprisingly easy and fun to use, it's nearly infinitely replayable. In the early 90s, Stunts, Fury of the Furies, Super Frog Warlords 2 Deluxe and Scorched Earth, as different as these 5 games are, stole thousands of hours from myself and buddies of mine as we played them in multiplayer all the time. The Cool Croc Twins is an unusual single-screen platformer for up to 2 players. The ultimate goal of the game is for one of the crocodile twins, Punk or Funk, to reach a beautiful crocodile girl, by crocodile standards at least. So they compete through over 60 levels, scoring points, hoping to get to her. Well, if you play alone there's no competition really, but the game is still quite fun. Each level is built out of platforms surrounded by numerous bulbs that require lighting up. The mechanics are all based around reversing of gravity, so there's no jumping whatsoever, but you may reverse it to change the side you are standing on from the bottom to the top. And I know it sounds weird, but that's the best way of describing it. Because the gravity's pulling side doesn't have to be down or up. You can actually stand on the left side of the vertical platform, with said left being the floor for you, just to switch the gravity and change the sides to the right. Honestly, looking at the face Batman is making now, I feel like I'm not explaining it best. It's probably good that there's video in the background, as it's worth 1,000 words. Batman's not too bright when he hasn't had his coffee though, so perhaps I'm a bit too rough on him and should give him a little time. Anyway, walking on platforms, when you get to the edge of them, doesn't make you fall but cross to the other side, also switching the gravity for you automatically. To complete the level you have to lit up all the bulbs in it, and you do it by bumping them with your head Mario style. Each has to be hit thrice to be completely lit. Some levels feature obstacles like stones that have to be removed to open up access to the bulbs, and you do so by also banging them with your noggin. There are enemies that work collectively to reverse your progress by turning the bulbs off. They move using the same mechanics you do, so can access everywhere you can. If you play Cool Croc Twins using VGA, the game looks really nice and colorful, and all the sprites are smoothly animated and cute. EGA and CGA are not worth your time, so if that's your only choice, then the game is much better played on the Amiga, or even, believe it or not, C64. Arnie 2, aka Arnie Savage Combat Commando, is an isometric action/shooter with the main character's likeness everywhere other than the box cover, based on Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it's a sequel to an earlier C64 and Amiga game, Arnie. That was a side-scrolling shooter platformer. A new isometric view made the presentation feel more modern, but in the same time introduced a whole set of new issues. The inability to move behind the objects for one, which is odd and feels out of place in a game where basically it looks as if you could hide behind every single thing on the screen. It can lead to a situation where you'll be backed into a corner thinking you have a way to escape, when in fact you'll effectively be blocked. The enemy IQ is also not great, though this can obviously be excused in a game where they serve in most cases as cannon fodder for our hero to plow through. At least there's quite a few of these. From simple infantry with rifles, through soldiers with rocket launchers, all the way to the tanks and helicopters. While you start with basic gun and a limited supply of grenades, some of defeated foes drop their more powerful weapons and other useful pickups like first aid kits and extra lives. Arnie 2 is not the best arcade game out there, but if you like the genre, it's a decent one and can be quite fun for a single playthrough, especially that it's not very long and only features 4 main missions. Shutdown of a chemical plant by blowing up 15 pipeline valves, clearing an airfield of enemy units, infantry and mechanized, climbing from one battleship to another in a hostile harbor, and finally rescue operation where you have to save as many POWs from jungle camp as you manage. I'd like to add here that now it's the best time to play Arnie 2 given the recent release of Fubar on Netflix. Hold on a sec, my assistant seems to have something to add. Yeah? Okay, got it. Yep. Alright, he asked me to tell you that he's Batman. Since we've already covered one game using image of 80s and 90s action hero today, why not tackle another? This time, however, the likeness is officially licensed and is not of a bodybuilder/actor, but wrestler/actor. There seems to be a lot of slashes here today. I gotta talk to my assistant, he seems to be leaving way too many of these in. He's probably drinking again. Ever since he stopped fighting crime in Gotham, he's been sleeping. Anyway, Suburban Commando is an action game based on the movie of the same title starring Hulk Hogan. While he was not a great actor, I could think of many worse, and he did rode on the wave of his WWF popularity and milk that cash cow in the early 90s as much as he could. And good, cause that's what you do when you know your limitations and notice the peak that you're on. Apparently as Batman and I, we're still trailing the valleys with no peaks in sight, so we can only theorize about it. So, Suburban Commando, the game, is an odd mixture. It's part horizontally scrolling space shooter, part platformer and part versus fighter, and it loosely follows the plot of the movie. In first level you're flying through space, destroying enemy drone formations and collecting power-ups. It's viewed from a side perspective and plays similarly but not as good as R-Type or Project X. Then there are 3 consecutive platforming stages in which you have to find 9 items each. As you do that, you'll fight many different enemies using 2 universally known wrestling attacks of punches and kicks, while avoiding being shot. And finally, after each of the missions, you'll encounter a boss enemy who you'll be battling in a versus fighter mode. It's worth mentioning that while the first 2 game modes are not great, they are correctly realized and are actually fun. The versus fighting sections are terrible. Sure, there's an attack or 2 more than in platforming, but they're spectacularly disappointing. And the whole segment feels like an afterthought added mid-development to spice up the gameplay, rather than something that was planned from day one. All in all, Suburban Commando is not bad, but it's not great either. Just is. Kinda like Batman after he retired. Nothing special about him, just a half-man half-bat working for a small YouTuber. Bad blood is what Batman and I have. Ever since I've noticed that he's been slacking off as my bat servant, I mean bat assistant obviously, and he's been making tons of bat mistakes. If he wasn't free, I would have bat rid of him a long time ago. Oh my god, I think I'm reaching new heights of cringe. Anyway, Bad Blood is also a top-down action game with some light role-playing elements. After the nuclear war that devastated the world was long over and the debris and radiation in large parts fell down, uncovering the sun once more, humanity survived. But it was changed. Large cities were populated by the pure-blood humans, while mutants lived in villages and small settlements, making a living hunting various irradiated creatures and monsters. Your village chief entrusted you with a mission of preventing the war between the factions, as one of the human leaders, so-called Lord Dominix, started forming a plan to eradicate all mutants once and for all. You start the game by picking a predefined character out of the available 3, a strong mutant fighting with bare hands, a human male with knife, or a human-mutant hybrid female that looks human but can shoot lasers out of her eyes. Cool. Which my assistant is saying reminds him of a budget Superman, another person he apparently had some beef with. Anyway, the setting of the game is really captivating. It's far of future on Earth, and many of the technologies that we have now and take for granted are either long forgotten, lost, or misspelled after decades last few were created. Uzis, for instance, so those automatic pistols that speed bullets faster than your mother-in-law can list your insecurities, is actually spelled O-Z and E, Uzi. There's plenty of these small touches in the game that may seem irrelevant at first, but all put together create the atmosphere of grim post-war post-tech society that is definitely on the downfall rather than on its way to rise again. Bad Blood is real-time and all its combat is action-based too. That said, it may require a bit of kiting at times as enemies are quite challenging. But if you master the hit and run technique, you'll soon forget that you're doing it all together. It won't change much throughout the game though, as the only way you can get better is by equipping more powerful weapons, because there's virtually no character development in Bad Blood whatsoever. The game features day-night cycle and it influences the number of opponents on the screen and limits access to certain NPCs or areas. It's worth pointing out that completing the game features a very satisfying ending, which was not always the case in the early 90s. Bumpy's Arcade Fantasy is an arcade puzzler unlike most. I mean, the basic concept is very simple, and even an average Batman would be able to grasp what it's all about. In short, you play as a bouncing smiley face ball that has to collect all items on each level and then get to the exit. All levels are single screen only and feature various different platforming challenges, usually based on the number and kinds of platforms within. And there's surprisingly many. I mean, I've not completed the game, but there's a lot. There are standard ones that do nothing special, they're just there for you to jump on. Kinda like my assistant, Manbat or whatever his name is. He's nothing special and he's seemingly just there for the sake of being here, cause he sure as hell doesn't do his job. There are also trampoline platforms that allow for much higher bounces, movable platforms, teleport platforms that do what you'd expect them to based on the name only, pass-through platforms that only allow of passing in one indicated on the direction, spiky platforms that you should not bounce on, and bumpers that bounce you diagonally. And that all is just scratching the surface. The underlying mechanics and goal of each level is very simple, so that the Bumpy's Arcade Fantasy has a very low entry point and is a fun introduction to puzzle games for those who are not familiar with the genre. But don't get fooled, while the difficulty curve is very forgiving, it does grow constantly, even if just by a little per each stage. Eventually you'll find yourself in a point where you need to start considering how to approach the level, planning your each next bounce. So while it's simple to get into, it's progressing in such a way that puzzle lovers of all skills will like it. Not many people short of World's Greatest Detective know that Shadow of Y Cerberus was actually originally an online-only game, a MUD, so multi-user dungeon that ran on Sierra's own network. This Shadow of Y Cerberus is an offline version of the same game. It is viewed from the first-person perspective and takes place in dungeons below the titular Volcano Y Cerberus. The story advances along with your leveling up and progressing through the dungeon, which I must add features an automap system which is always fun in games like that. Shadow of Y Cerberus is not a game for everyone. It requires a very specific player, a person who either grew up on these older, simpler dungeon crawlers or likes progressing for the sake of getting better. A min-max player to whom the story and long conversations with branching paths are just a stopgap in enjoyment of the game. If you are such person, you'll have a great time playing Y Cerberus. If you're not, then this may actually be the game to stay away from. Why? Because it's very simple. There's hardly any NPCs, and these that are there are relegated to role of hint-giving machines. Story unfolds slowly based on the character progression and not dialogue or choices that you make, and assembly line monster killing in hack and slash style is fun but doesn't feel to have much depth to it. You do it to get further, to get better, to carry on. Thing is, the biggest attraction of the original was the fact that you enjoyed it with others. You traversed the dungeons with friends or people you just met, and the need for the adventure is what connected you, what effectively made you a party exploring endless dungeons. Single-player version does not offer that, and this is precisely why it's a game for a very specific kind of a gamer. I'm usually not one, but from time to time I do find myself hankering for some dungeon crawling without any overarching stories, plots, just to get that progression achievement rush. Wild West World is original 1990 Amiga release that dropped on PC a year later, and it's a really interesting one. It's a strategy/management title that lets you run your own economic empire in the Wild West. And while it takes a little time to familiarize yourself with everything that's in the game, the time investment is worth it, as it rewards you with incredibly detailed simulation. Starting with the theme that's unmistakably Western-like in its design, through graphics, sound and music. Everything fits perfectly. Even weather conditions are time and location appropriate, offering scorching summers with hurricanes, steppe fires and all that changes with the passing seasons. It feels real. As much as it was possible in 1991, that is. You'll be involved in anything and everything you can afford to bring even more money in. So you'll buy the land, establish farms, ranches and mines, you'll need to hire workers for all of these and make sure that they always have enough supplies of livestock, food and tools, and are paid on time. Wild West World can be played either by 1 or 2 players on the same system, and it's obviously most fun against a buddy, or Batman, as he's whispering to me all throughout this game's running time to tell you just that. And that he's Batman. I really don't know why he's so keen on repeating who he is, but it is what it is. Shut up, Bruce, no one likes you. Can't you see that they don't care? Sorry guys, he's been very annoying ever since I mentioned him first. He seems to feel his newfound popularity will allow him to get back on the proverbial horse and restart his crime-fighting career once again somehow. Anyway, while the empire building and trading backbone of the game is very solid and most importantly fun, it's not what it's all about, as you don't really have to fight for the top dog spot clean and fair. In fact, you can act dirty just the way Wild West setting would expect you to. So you can hire gangs of outlaws to harass your opponent's lands or even aim to try to eliminate them, you can bribe Indians to burn their estates and kill their workers, and all that is just scratching the surface. As long as you can afford it, you can be a mean Wild West magnate. And you know what? You should, cause it's fun. And it will be a nice break from all the world saving that you usually do. Mirage Thunder is a fun, underrated, vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, and I really don't get why. It's a quality game that could easily be on a cabinet in an arcade somewhere, sitting in a remote gas station or in a dark corner of your local chicken joint, where no one sits unless other seats are already taken. And it would rack up some serious coins in either. It has great for the time and platform graphics and sound, the music tracks are not overly annoying, even if a bit repetitive, but most of all it plays great. It's fast and frantic, full of very distinct and innovative enemies that can range from various machines and ships, through insect-like aliens of various kinds to hybrids of the two. Not really machines yet, but not fully biological beings either. Bosses are really fun too, and there's a lot of them, often few per stage. They're all entirely different not only in terms of how they look, no sprite swaps here whatsoever, but also how they act and in terms of tactics that you need to use to defeat them. And it's a blast figuring it out. There's quite a few different weapons to choose too. They're all upgradable and allow you to pick your fave to best suit your game style. You can unlock the satellite ships that follow you and help, and missiles. Mirage Thunder's graphics are excellent, crisp and smooth, often using very large sprites, even up to a quarter of the screen in size. Parallax scrolling, while sparse and only ever occurring here and there, is quite nice and adds to the overall presentation too. Honestly, Mirage Thunder has been a surprise for me, as I somehow overlooked it back in the day, and it looks hella tasty. If you enjoy shooters, this one's a sweet treat. But if you're more into savory things, then it's a spicy, salty heaven that just melts on your screen. Come to think of it, some stages actually kinda look like it. Anyway, what I was failing to say here was, give it a go. I know that this video is called Best Obscure Those Games You've Never Heard Of, but Interactive Girls' Vida X is definitely not the best at anything. Well, cringe perhaps, but that's debatable. That said, for some, it may be so incredibly bad that it actually becomes good. So on that notion, I've elected to talk about it anyway. Oh, and despite the subject, don't worry, no not safe for work content will be shown here. Although I gotta say that when I mentioned that I'll be covering this one, it was probably the only time in the last 2 weeks that I saw Batman put away a bag of chips and acting genuinely interested. But the little perv he is, he will not get to see anything obscene here today. Anyway, Interactive Girls, or Vida X or whatever it's really called, is generally speaking a point-and-click adventure game that substituted interesting and involving puzzles, unique locales and characters to meet with digitized still images of ladies. Or a lady in this particular case, cause there were supposed to be more of these games in the series, and as far as I know, only 2 ever came out. But whatever, we're talking about Vida X today. Story of Vida X is so shallow, it's like a dried up puddle. There's this lady whose name I've mentioned probably 50 times already, and she's for better or worse interested in you. And what your ultimate goal is to take her home with you and sweep her off her feet. I mean, not in a creepy pervy way, yeah, I'm looking at you Bruce, but woo her with your personality, so that she would eventually agree to make sweet love to you. And it's so simple, it's hard to call it a game really. More like a mouse-click simulator. For one, you cannot make the wrong choice here when talking to Vida. I mean, you can, but the game will just tell you what your mistake was and revert you back to the point where you've made it, so that you could pick something else. You can literally complete this whole affair, pun intended, in 20-30 minutes and be done with it. It's not great, guys, but it has to be seen to be believed how cringe a game can become, and still act as if it was a serious product. What were the devs thinking? Well, they either went for the aforementioned so bad it's good vibe, or just wanted to get the sales on a pure foundation of potential buyers' horniness. So, approach Vida X only as a novelty and don't expect to invest any real time in it. As Overkill itself says just before the title screen when you launch it, it's not a shareware game. And honestly, it doesn't look like one, but since it was released by Epic Mega Games, then masters of the shareware, I kinda get the sentiment of why it had to be included in the game, so that people would not share it without paying. But people will do what they will do, so there's that. No message could prevent it. Anyway, Overkill is a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, and it may very well be the best DOS EGA shooter. The jury's still out on that. Sure, there were better VGA games, but for EGA, it's hard to find one. Especially that the colors are so smartly used and mixed in a way that I'm sure you wouldn't have noticed that it's EGA if I haven't told you. Oh well, even if I'm wrong, I can tell you that Batman dropped a candy bar and spilled his soda when he heard that it was not VGA. So, we've established that the graphics are great for the hardware, but what about the sound design? Well, the MIDI music is pretty decent and appropriately actiony for the lack of a better word, it just fits. Sound, however, is a hot mess. It only works with PC speaker, and while there were some rare occasions when people were able to squeeze something semi-decent from it, Overkill is not the case. All the beeps and boops are annoying, and it's sad but there was no attention put towards Sunblaster support that by 1993 was widely available. Story-wise, you come back home after long being away and realize that your planet is no more, destroyed by an evil alien race. Well, it's too late for it, it's not for the universe itself, so you, being the galactic badass that you are, decide to single-handedly, like a proper late 80s superhero, rid the space of the Scourge. You head out to attack and destroy all 6 of evil aliens' planets and eventually their battle star, which is what Death Star was supposed to be, but the aliens have run out of advertising budget and the name was conceived internally without help of external dedicated ad agencies. A mistake on their side, but not the worst one. Worst was pissing you off. There's quite a few weapons available in Overkill and they're upgraded by adding satellite miniships to your fighter, and you can have even up to 6 of these. So the variety is definitely there. And if you like shooters, you will love this fast and, believe it or not, fairly balanced game. It's not too tough, not too easy, it's just perfect. So, this is the last episode in the series for this first season. The next one will launch the second. How did you find today's 10 games? Any you knew of? Did something surprise you among the choices? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. If you didn't, well, then there's thumbs down there too, but I suppose you wouldn't have persevered up to this point if you really didn't. Around 60% of you are not subscribed and there's currently no way of knowing if YouTube will decide to recommend you the next episode or not, other than subscribing and hitting the bell, that is. And that bell is amazing, as whenever the new video is out, YouTube will actually send you small and friendly notification about it so you wouldn't miss it. If you'd like to support the channel, Patreon and YouTube memberships are a great way of doing so. They will help me release better content, and members also get first dibs on all new videos before they're publicly accessible on YouTube. If you can't or don't want to do that though, likes and subscribes are great too. I would like to take a moment here and thank all the YouTube creators from whose videos short bits were taken to serve as a background to my commentary. They're all amazing and stars among the retro community and deserve your subscription. They all have mine. You'll find names of their channels at the top of the screen when their footage is running and also in the video description below. For me though, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time. Peace.